Dear Rector, dear honorable guests, dear deans, dear academics and distinguished participants, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. As Yaşar University, the Faculty of Communication, in collaboration with ECREA, Journalism and Communication Education Temporary Working Group, we have organized Alternatives in Communication Theory and Education Colloquium. It's our Yaşar Universities and ECREA. It's ECREA TWG. It's a pleasure to meet you here at Yaşar University in Selçuk Yaşar campus in Izmir. We welcome you all with our warmest greetings. Dear guests, this opening ceremony is being broadcast live on the Yaşar University's YouTube channel by the Media Center. Please switch off your mobile phones and electronic devices during the sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you the details about today's program. Opening remarks, Professor Sevda Alankuş, Dean of the Faculty of Communication, and Assistant Professor Tijana Vukic, ECREA Journalism and Communication Education Temporary Working Group representative. Professor Berin Yanıkkaya, board member of the Communication Research Association, Turkey, and Professor Cemali Dinçer, director of Yaşar University. And keynote speeches, Professor Mahmut Mutman, University of Tampere, Professor Stina Bengtson, University of Södertörn, Professor Mark Doos, University of Amsterdam. After the opening ceremony, the lunch will be served at 1:15, and we will transfer to the historical Gold Gas Factory for the afternoon session, which will start at 3 p.m. Dear guests, to begin with the welcome and opening remarks, I would like to kindly invite the Dean of the Faculty of Communication of Yaşar University. Please welcome Professor Sevda Alankuş.
Dear Rector, valuable guests, distinguished colleagues, and dear students, I warmly welcome you to the joint colloquium of Alternatives in Communication Theory and Education organized by the Faculty of Communication of Yaşar University and the European Communication Research and Education Association. It's our great pleasure to host you here today at Yaşar University campus and tomorrow at the historical coal factory in the downtown of Izmir. I would also welcome our participants to join us via Zoom and our audience to watch us through our YouTube channel. We are delighted and in fact very excited about holding our first international academic event that we had to delay. Pandemic, in fact, made us apart for a long time, but also inspired us to do our best with the opportunities of the digital world to come together and be in touch as of today's hybrid colloquium. And not only that, this period made us consider what we are already doing, and how we are preparing our students and ourselves for the future as academics and the communication professionals. I believe that it would not only the right time, in the right time rather than this period we are going through to reflect on what we currently have in academia and the sector, and to project into where we are heading. These two words, reflection and projection, will be keywords of the colloquium. If I put it differently, in the age of all the posts, for instance, post-truth, what we know about communication and communication education are needed to be revised, redefined, and reframed through projections into future. It seems that we have to change our angle and leave aside the conventional discussion, such as which must be given to the students first, the theory or the practice, or do we have to educate students to meet the sector's expectations or to change them? I don't mean that these questions, these discussions were meaningless, but answers already need to be adjusted to the changing conditions. Let me repeat, what is changing and how we have to adapt ourselves to the changes are the two main questions of the colloquium we will try to answer through the valuable contributions of keynote speakers and workshop participants. We will note the outcomes of the colloquium and consider them while redefining our curricula. And I do believe the insights that we will be getting at the end of these 2 days will be inspiring for all of us. While wishing you a productive 2 days, I have to express my gratitude to our rector for his support and encouragement, to our keynote speakers, Professor Mahmut Mutman, Professor Mark Deus, he will be joining us via Zoom, and Stine Bankston, Professor Stine Bankston, Professor Berin Yanıkkaya from Communication Research Association, and Professor Pantelis Vatikiotis, I think he's not here yet, yes, from Pantheon University, who will be sharing their approach to the communication field and education. I also have special thanks to the Assistant Professor Tiana Vukic. She is there. The Journalism and Communication Education Working Group representative of the ECRIA, who was so supportive from the very, very beginning of our preparations and join us now via Zoom. Moreover, to all my colleagues and media professionals for accepting our invitation and being with us here today. Last but not least, this event would not be possible if my colleagues' great effort would not be behind all these. I'm thankful to the Colloquium Organization Committee members, Vice Dean Hürriyet Toker and Ürün Önk, Associate Professor, I'm forgetting the titles, if you don't mind. I'm not going to give them all. Let me just give the names. Hürriyet Toker, Ürün Önk, Vice Deans, Gizem Melek, she's the head of the organization committee. Our sweet assistants, Öykü, Simge, I don't know where they are, Kardelen is there. And our department heads, and in fact, all of my colleagues, administrative personnel, and the students who made outstanding contributions for bringing us together. Finally, I thank, it's a long thanks. I thank to the Izmir Metropolitan Municipality for hosting us tomorrow for the workshops. Once more, you are welcome, and I wish you productive 2 days.
Thank you very much, dear Dean. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to kindly invite Assistant Professor Tiana Vukic, ECREA, Journalism and Communication Education Temporary Working Group representative from Zagreb. She'll be joining us online. Yes, Tiana.
Hi. Thank you very much. What do we see when we look around us? Not just metaphorically, in reality as well. The world as we know it is changing as we speak. Knowledge is expanding. The process of demanding and delivering it, learning and teaching processes are reshaping. Possibilities are multiplying. Past dreams are nowadays habits. Hidden ideas are within easy reach. Today's science achieves yesterday's supernatural aspirations. Generations differs in a variety of colors, beginnings and endings with communication. Everything and everyone everywhere is connected. Media and communication professions are directly affected with the development of communication technologies, while institutions which educate those professionals have to balance between changes in media markets and new educational standards. So to live, work, and teach professionally in such fluid and complex systems behind and in front of the screen induces questions about alternatives in communications and rethinking of education for media and communication professions from theoretical, empirical, and practical understanding. Therefore, gathering like this one today secure sustainability of our research and professional field. This is 8th year that Journalism and Education Temporary Working Group has planned conferences and other yearly events in different European countries, and we are very happy that we have had a chance to give an organizational opportunity to different members and organizational teams. It confirms our members are proactive and innovative, most importantly, taking very seriously scientific progress in our field, which require continuous public debate, networking, and exchange of experiences and knowledge from both theoretical and professional perspective. Is the future of communication and communication education already here? Well, that is what we are going to find out during the next 2 days thanks to our Turkish colleagues, with whom ICRIA's temporary working group Journalism and Communication Education is very proud to collaborate with regarding this event. Therefore, thanks goes to the Yasi University and Faculty of Communication as our hosts. On behalf of management team of the temporary working group Journalism and Communication Education, our members and ICRIA in general, I wish you all to have a great time and fruitful dialogue. Greetings from Croatia to everyone in Izmir and to all of those who follow us online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Vukic. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to kindly invite the board member of the Communication Research Association Turkey. Please welcome Professor Berin Yanıkkaya.
Thank you. Good morning. Dear all, I'm just going to skip this part. It was longer. I'm honored to be here today representing ILAT Communication Research Association, which has also been serving as the Quality Assurance, aka Program Accreditation Agency for Communication Education in Turkey. The president of ILAT, Professor Aysel Aziz, could not be here with you today, but she sent her best wishes and her appreciation for organizing such an important gathering at this very unprecedented moment in time when we're still trying to understand what the post-pandemic era will mean for higher education in general and communication education in particular. The role ILAT has played in assuring the minimum standards for quality education in various fields of communication studies has become far more important in recent years, as the quality assurance proved to be advancing the programs, thus supporting staff and students in higher education institutions. Therefore, along with ILAT's original objectives of encouraging, supporting, rewarding, and disseminating rigorous research in communication studies in Turkey, since it was established in 1989, its new and growing role of elevating communication education in the country, monitoring the recent trends in teaching and learning, and sharing the best practices amongst the communication community at national and international levels has been widely acknowledged and appreciated. I am skipping a few parts here. And because of the post-pandemic era that we will be experiencing and we've started to experience already, there are some tendencies which will affect us all, no matter where we live in. And the indexes show that 85% of the jobs that will be out there in the next 10 years are unknown to us at the moment, and they have not been invented yet. So this might also enforce us to discuss the structure of higher education, but will most definitely require that we revisit the curriculum design and development practices. Not only scholars in education, but all of us will need to discuss concepts such as backward design, active learning, skills-based learning, summative and formative assessments, constructive alignments, peer evaluation, and so on. So how will we implement the curriculum weaved with the skills that we would like to equip our students with, and what kind of skills? Beyond question, the transferable ones. As scholars in communication, are we going to take the lead in this transformation and change for the better? That is a question that we need to ask ourselves today, I believe, and here is why. Those indexes that I have just mentioned predict that every single new graduate will need to have the following skill sets: creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, project management, teamwork, leadership, agility, resilience, collaboration, listening skills, and so on. As I'm sure you would also agree, these are all communication skills or communication related skills. And who will need them? A creative strategist, a marketing professional, a cybersecurity expert, a data analyst. The answer is all of the above. Therefore, communication education is not only important for students studying in this field, but also for those specializing in other fields such as medicine, engineering, law, business, international relations, and so on. Because as we all know, it all comes down to human communication. So the past 2 years have reminded us how fundamental human communication is, especially during regular and irregular lockdown intervals. We realize that communicating with one another is a necessity. Therefore, we cannot emphasize enough the centrality of interpersonal communication. When we try to envision the future of communication, education especially, we often start thinking of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, digital media, digital technologies, digital tools, platforms, metaverse, and so on. However, the major part of our conversations must still be in relation with interpersonal communication and what happens to the individual and the societies we live in. We cannot overlook these two. So I believe we will be discussing all these and more today and tomorrow. I'm very much looking forward to the roundtables, keynotes, and the outcomes of this two-day event, which I hope to be first of the many to come. Once again, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Yanıkkaya. Dear guests, I would like to kindly invite the Rector of Yaşar University. Please welcome Professor Cemali Dinçer.
Dear honorable guests, distinguished participants, dear students and colleagues. As Yaşar University, in collaboration with European Communication Research and Education Association, which is the leading international organization in the field of communication, our Faculty of Communication organized Alternatives in Communication Theory and Education Colloquium as a joint event for the first time. It is our pleasure to meet you here at our campus, Yaşar University. We welcome you all with our warmest greetings. Yaşar University is a young and dynamic foundation university located in this beautiful city of Izmir, considers how global and national changes require us reflecting on our doings and adjusting our education to do what future expects from us. We give great importance to international contacts, collaborations with the media sector and other universities and colleges, and last but not the least, with the Communication Resource Association, İLAT. That is also accreditation body for the Faculty of Communications in Turkey. Today's colloquium hosts outstanding participants who will be framing and discussing the future of communication education. And I so strongly believe that it is indeed the right time to do, and particularly due to changes pandemic has brought not only in our daily life, but to the field of education and the sector of communication. I also think that the colloquium will give a unique opportunity to discuss the theory and will guide faculties and the professionals of the sector to rethink the transformation of the societies and to adjust themselves accordingly. Your presence here with us today are more than valuable. And I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Professor Stina Bengtson, Professor Mark Deus, and Professor Mahmut Mutman for their invaluable contributions. I would also like to thank the communication specialists of the field and academicians who agreed to come from different cities, sharing the same excitement with us. Moreover, thanks for the support and presence of İLAT, Association of Communication Research, the exclusive association in its kind in Turkey, and Dr. Pantelis Vatikiotis, who is also with us within the Erasmus Exchange Program and will be sharing his country's unique experiences in this field. I hope that this colloquium will be productive and remarkable for all participants. I also sincerely believe and expect that it will be very successful event, and I respectfully greet you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Rector. Dear guests, it's time to start plenary sessions. This year, we are pleased to be hosting very eminent members of the world of communication. Our first keynote speaker, Professor Mahmut Mutman. Professor Mutman is a senior researcher at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Tampere University, Finland. Previously, he worked at the Middle East Technical University, Tufts University, Bilkent University, and Istanbul Şehir University. He is specialized in the fields of critical theory, post-colonial studies, and film and media studies. He is the author of The Politics of Writing Islam, Voicing Difference. He has co-edited as a special issue of the Inscriptions titled Orientalism and Cultural Differences and the collection of Orientalism, Hegemony, and Cultural Difference, as well as several articles on Orientalism, nationalism, Islamism, postmodernism, and the film and the media in Cultural Critic, Postmodern Culture, New Formations, Rethinking Marxism, Anthropological Theory, Radical Philosophy, Third Text, Toplum and Bilim, and Sinesin. We are glad to have the chance to listen to his presentation titled Indisciplinary Reflections on the Concept of Communication. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our honor to call the stage. Please welcome Professor Mahmut Mutman.
Hello, everyone. Do you mind if I might check it off? Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me here and thank you for coming to my talk. I would love to share a few ideas with you. This is a little bit of a mad talk. There is not a good connection between the beginning and the end, but just accept it as it says in the title, indisciplinary reflections. Of course, indisciplinary, there is no such word in English. It's my neologism. The word is indiscipline, I think, but I thought I can make a little bit of contribution to the English language. And I will approach the concept of communication. It's a bit of a theoretical kind of paper. And I'm afraid I'm not as hopeful as Tiana about the state of the world today. So it's a little bit of a theoretical kind of tour around the world. And I'll approach the concept of communication from an oblique angle by a discussion of Karl Marx's concept of value, which will allow me to move to a certain feature of present-day capitalism. This will not be a proper theoretical discussion on the concept of value, but I would only emphasize a certain aspect. This is making such a noise. It's really annoying, but it's okay. I guess we can make do with it. Sorry if I make too much noise. If you don't hand on it, then it's okay. This will not be a proper theoretical discussion of the concept of value as it is discussed in political economy, but it's an approach from the view of media studies, let's say. The core assumption of Marx's theory is that labor power is not labor, but the irreducible possibility that human body is more than adequate to itself. Its use, its hiring by capital creates value, greater value than it costs itself. Although most of the time, this approach is interpreted in terms of a theory of representation of labor in value, I would like to associate myself with a minority reading Writers such as Gayatri Spivak, Antonio Negri, Diane Elson, and Thomas Keenan, all writing on the concept of value, who suggested each in his or her own way that value in Marx is not only representation, but also difference, or better put, a differential. Reading Marx closely, it is quite legitimate to say that value is exchange value. And he uses the concept of use value as a lever or as a theoretical fiction, to employ Spivak's metaphor, in order to make the production of economic value intelligible. Use value is an enabling problematization of value, since it is both inside and outside the system, both independent of the system of exchange value, but not entirely so, because exchange value is parasitical upon it. It is for this reason that Marx emphasizes the difference of the worker. That is to say, wage is not the same money as capital. You are probably guessing why I have begun by arguing that value in Marx is not just representation of labor, but also a differential, a difference. I would like to bring him closer to post-semiotic approaches, the kind of approach that puts the emphasis on difference. Value is differential since it betrays a relational structure and constitutes a language or text in this specific sense. Let's go the opposite way. Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of sign can be called idealist in a philosophical sense, to the extent that it considers sign as a unitary operator, which consists of two connected parts, however arbitrarily connected: an acoustic image, a signifier, and a concept, a signified. This might be similar to an idealist reading of Marx's theory as reducible to a representation of labor, signified, in value, signifier. However, as Saussure has also argued, language is a system of differences without positive terms, meaning that it's a differential system. And indeed, is this is the definition of language Saussure makes when he comes to discuss the concept of linguistic value, as distinct from that of meaning in language. Value is a differential in Marx's text also because the process in which value moves, that's the value chain of value, money, capital, is not linear and continuous, but it involves a number of discontinuities between capital and labor, value and money, money and capital. The process is reversible and the coding of value is open. While the development of capital decodes all previous ties and relations and frees the laborer, it is necessary to recode value so that an order will be maintained. The media are a major site of this recoding of value. I'm going to do three things. First of all, I'll look at the financial markets. That's why I have begun with Marx. And then I'll discuss the concept of communication. And then I'll return to media and I'll talk about television a little bit and conclude with the analysis of a photograph. Before focusing on the financial market, I should remind that Marx's concept of money also betrays the textuality of value. To give a brutal summary of his argument, the money commodity, which is always a coin, a precious material, is separated from its being as an exchangeable commodity. Thank you, this is really helping. Therefore, at the same time, sorry, this is a little too quick. Okay, a brutal summary. The money commodity, which is always a coin, a precious metal, is separated from its own being as an exchangeable commodity. Therefore, at the same time, if money form is cut off from all relation to circulation, then the being of money would turn into a simple natural object. Fake money would serve exactly the same function. It is therefore circulation process which bestows the sign character relationality or textuality upon the money form. Now, following Gayatri Spivak's lead, I want to turn to an interesting passage in Marx's unpublished notes, Grundrisse, in German. It means outline. He never published it. He was published later on in early 20th century. We can find a clue in this passage that I'm going to read from Grundrisse. We can find a clue to understand our present. In the chapter on capital, he writes, this is a little bit of a difficult kind of, how do I do this? Okay, here. How do I move this? Okay. Okay. Go on. Ah, the image there is, yeah. Oh, no, I just get rid of this. So that you'll see the paragraph. Yeah, he's talking about the relationship between circulation and production. The continuity of production presupposes that circulation time has been sublated. Now, sublated in German is aufgehoben, is a very difficult philosophical word, which Hegel used a lot, and he's taking it from the philosopher Hegel. It means both cancelled and affirmed at the same time, and not suspended, as Martin Nicolaus and Google Translation translated. Continuity of production presupposes that circulation time has been sublated. The nature of capital presupposes that it, value, travels through the different phases of circulation, not as it does in the mind, where one concept turns into the other at the speed of thought in no time, but rather as situations separated in terms of time. To briefly summarize what he's saying here, capitalist has to sell his product, his or her product. That's called valorization. In order to be able to return to the production process, to re-begin the production process. Circulation time is a barrier. It appears as a barrier to production because you have to spend time there until you get back to production. Of course, circulation time does not enter into the determination of value, but its speed determines the speed with which the production process can be repeated. If the circulation of value takes place at the speed of thought in the mind, in no time, or in Marx's Hegelian language, if it is sublated into the mind, then valorization appears as a barrier. It's no longer a barrier. But value has to circulate, according to Marx, in stages separate in time. So we may ask, is the circulation time of value sublated into the speed of mind in contemporary telecommunications? What are some of the consequences of the circulation of value attaining the instantaneity of thought? This is not the old idea that's being repeated much by several people. Annihilation of space by time, David Harvey's condition of postmodernity. All that is solid melts into air, Marshall Berman's condition of modernity, and so on and so forth. You may proliferate examples. But for Gayatri Spivak, the answer is the international division of labor. The continuity of production ensured by instantaneity must be broken up by capital. Labor reserves in the periphery must be kept outside the access to instantaneous communication, and the multinational investment should not realize itself fully there through the assimilation of workers into consumerist humanism. As the production of relative value increases capital expenditure, technological innovation, the contradictory drive is to have more absolute, less relative value. The periphery is kept in a state of primitive labor legislation. That is Chinese Communist Party, Vietnamese Communist Party, serving as a guardian for multinationals, which are in China and Vietnam because there's cheap labor there. According to Michael Hart and Tony Negri, society itself has become a factory under telecommunications. They are all social workers. The social workers slaving on laptops are mostly located in the Western metropolitan space, in Europe and North America, or in developed parts of the underdeveloped countries like this university. But who has placed the microchips into their machine? And who has tailored their shirts and jeans? These are women between the ages of 15 and 14, located in the peripheries from Malaysia and China to Sultanbeyli or Soweto. Karl Marx's working class seems to have moved to the periphery and have gone through a sex reassignment surgery, to use the appropriate medical terminology, weaving the texture and installing the text of value. If they have a contract, it is usually signed by their father or husband. Extra economic coercion is in place, the distance is safe. In such fine jobs as placing the microchips and sewing t-shirts, the myth of humans' manual dexterity is what Nobel laureate Gary Becker would have called human capital. For Marx, it is the special commodity called labor power, which is simply human capacity to work, predicated as super adequate by capital, can produce more than what is necessary because it has use value to it. What are some of the instances of the instantaneity of communication here? I forgot to put my watch. That's what I need to do. What are some of the instances of the instantaneity of communication? Financial market, the temple of Marx's circulation time, is a major site. A veritable assemblage of economic information, communication, and transaction, in which the circulation of value is out of control. Today, the velocity of the circulation of value has reached such a degree that it is nearly impossible to make a healthy predication in an increasingly vulnerable and volatile global financial market, despite the apparent maintenance of equilibrium and stability. And actually, just last night, I have come across with a news piece which says that the financial markets are going a little awkward again. There's a rise, there's a fall in prices and so on and so forth. Some of the recent literature point to the limits of the science of statistics. Financial market is open to black swan events. That is to say, statistically unpredictable events of major impact, such as the 2008 crisis. A black swan is rare to find, so it's a metaphor in statistics. Option trader and theorist at the same time, Eli Ayash, declared the end of probability and argued for what he called absolute contingency in the financial market. According to Ayash, the financial market has created its own version of future anterior. This is a difficult tense. In English, sometimes it's called future present. but the French word for it, future anterior, is mostly accepted in English as well. The financial market has created its own version of future anterior, shall have been, it shall have been, I shall have been, in the so-called derivatives. What's that derivative? We are now in the domain of what Marx called the foreign language of money. It's a form of security. Let's assume you are not sure if the price of your product will be the same in 6 months. You may sign a futures contract with a buyer who is ready to buy it at today's price 6 months later. This is the simplest form of a derivative called a futures contract. And there are very, very complicated forms of derivatives. You can sell and buy bonds, currencies, and so on and so forth. Defined as a legal agreement to buy or sell a commodity asset at a predetermined price at a specific time in future, a derivative is a financial version of the tense we call future anterior. What I shall have been for what I am in the process of becoming. Or a written contract that looks to the future through the transaction date and then turn back to see this future date as having already happened to correlate it with a set price, the derivative's value at transaction. It transforms the context, the derivative transforms the context into which it is written and further changes it through its very operation. As we learned from Catherine Hales, the speed reached by the computers that operate in high-frequency trading, HFT, is far ahead of human cognitive power. Algorithms process data, draw inferences, make decisions in milliseconds. When derivatives operate in high-frequency trading, financial markets become structurally vulnerable to feedback loops and self-amplifying dynamics. That is to say, they are open to black swan events. A black swan event can also be described as the effect of a message gone astray. What we have in the financial market is also a case of communication of messages and information. Most of the communication or media scholars would not accept financial market as a proper object of study in their field. However, if we take a short look at the recent literature on financial markets, which is as varied as sociological, economic, or financial studies, or historical or ethnographic ones, we will find out frequent reference to the notions of communicative imperative or linguistic failure. In a recent study titled Banking on Words, the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai has argued that the financial crisis is a failure of language. Derivatives constitute a chain of promises, what linguistics called performatives. A promise is a performative. A performative is, according to the pragmatic theory of language, language doesn't just describe the world. Language does something. A promise is an example of language doing something. When you give a promise, actually, language is not describing the world, but it's acting. Arjun Appadurai has argued that, yes, okay, where am I? While the very act of trading turns into an absolute measure by means of which uncertainty is constantly transformed into certainty, the proliferation of derivatives lead to a situation in which promises begin to work against each other, and the chain of promises is broken. That's Arjun Appadurai. Another study, Douglas Holmes's equally riveting work titled Economy of Words, shows how central banks actually make future in their imperative communication with what they call the public, who are in fact the managers of multinational corporations rather than ordinary working people. While these works show the significance of communication and language for financial market, I would like to argue that it is the textuality signifying aspect of value itself that is at stake. The foreign language of money is now spoken in electronic impulses or digits moving at the speed of light in no time. But there's a paradox. Although, as we have shown above, it is this acceleration, time in no time, time running ahead of itself, that is responsible for crisis, for the breakdown of financial markets such as we have seen in 2008. It is the utter perfection and super efficiency of the machines of information and communication that makes acceleration possible. In other words, the more efficient the communication system is, the more it is open to failure and the more prone to crisis the market is. We need to remember, as we have learned from the models of communication, that efficient communication or flow of information is one without noise or friction. That is to say, it is one that is coded or programmed and works programmatically. Program, this Latin word means pre-written, written ahead, written beforehand. Rather than focusing on the opposition between humans and machines, which is the old story of alienation, though it's to some extent relevant, or teaching our students how to communicate efficiently as if machines are immune to failure, I suggest that we follow Catherine Hale's, critical of what she describes as Eli Ayash's mad neoliberal fantasy. She was a little upset with him. She suggests that we study these assemblages carefully so that we will be able to develop a new distribution between human and technical agencies in order to attain more sustainable, just, and equitable results. I would like to make a supplement to Catherine Hale's. We should also perhaps also focus on the strange phenomenon of a programmatical failure. Although it is programmed, pre-written, the gram, that is to say, the written or inscribed trace or mark, call it value, escapes its programming. This is what crisis is, after all. Perhaps one thing we could do in terms of pedagogy of communication studies is teach our students how to track this escaping gram, value or sign on the run, how to make it readable, how to interrupt its uncanny fluency. I shall develop some vague approach to this at the end of the paper, but for now, let's mark the paradox. The more efficient the communication is, the more likely the crisis becomes. Surely we cannot generalize from the financial market. The reason why we cannot is that we have only engaged the question of the speed of circulation of value so far, which is the effect of a problematic of efficiency and profit. We have not said much about the nature of value as sign, treating its flow as always already coded, programmed, or intended. But what if the failure of communication in the financial market is the particular case of a more general failure inherent to the process of communication itself? And what about the nature of value as sign? In a highly entertaining and engaging work of philosophy titled The Postcard, Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, has argued that the very concept of communication, and that is to say all the models of communication we had so far, depends on what he called a postal problematic. That is to say, a problematic of sending. If the postal system, there's something called postal system, if the postal system is based on the assumption that the letter or the message should arrive at its destination, if all the laws, to begin with the one that requires a mailing address or the postal stamp or the password, and all the devices on the machines, codes, and programs aim to ensure that the sign or message does not deviate from its route, that it stays on its proper route and arrives at its proper destination, then, if it is so, then it is already assumed that it may not arrive. The possibility that the message or the sign may not arrive at its destination is necessary to the postal system. Derrida calls this possibility a necessary possibility. We have to be careful here. It's not that the message never arrives at its destination, but that it is necessarily possible that it may not. If such a possibility were not already presupposed and posed by the postal system, which is designed for delivery after all, no arrival would ever be possible. There are two further implications of this. If non-arrival is an internal possibility of the message or sign, then this can only mean that the sign is infinitely divisible, even though we may have to assume for practical as well as analytical purposes that it is unitary, as Ferdinand de Saussure had to assume. All the laws, devices, codes, and programs aim to keep the sign or the message intact, unbroken, pure, so that it will arrive its proper addressee. But if the sign is divided from the beginning, its reception or reading is necessarily open. It arrives without arriving. Reading differently, misreading. Further, if the sign is divided, we can no longer assume that the sender and the receiver are homogeneous and unified identities either, insofar as they are constituted in this process of the flow of signs. Such constitution is also discontinuous and open-ended. Let there be no misunderstanding here. The postal system, all our machines, codes, and programs are there working to ensure that a certain sender is sending a certain message to a certain receiver, because there's always the possibility of accidents, erring, mishaps, non-arrival, and this is a necessary possibility. The media must be seen at a crossroads from this point of view. As a system of measuring the production of value, capitalism produces universal equivalence and depends on the rational abstraction of democracy. A series of concepts such as rights, knowledge, public debate, education are just some of these universal equivalents. Let us take television as one example of media, as a part of media which kind of represents the whole of it, like what the rhetoricians call a synecdoche. A synecdoche is a part which represents the whole. So let us take the case of television. Television works by ratings, which is statistics working in the service of audience targeting to attract advertisers, who are the one and only source of profit. Nevertheless, there are two aspects of television. On the one hand, it is part of an apparatus of knowledge, information, and debate, which are essential to democracy. It is impossible to think of democracy today without assuming some kind of apparatus which provides us with information and debate. On the other hand, television's mode of operation can best be described as an unprecedented leveling of all difference. Television and media in general are a monstrous apparatus of production of sameness. Therefore, on the one hand, television seems to be indispensable, for even if it were pure propaganda, the moment we say that it is so, we are in the expectation of information and debate. Such is the law of the universal equivalent. It brings news and information from elsewhere, from where I am not, from a distance, from the world out there, something I do not know beforehand, and something that is supposed to make a difference in my life. And yet, on the other hand, as numerous studies have shown so far, one of the most insidious effects of television is its unique televisual creation of an equivalence of meaning, in which different worlds, equivalence of imaging, in which different worlds and events of different orders are unified in a homogeneous flow of images and words on a luminous screen. Television does not so much open up a space, but it abolishes distance insofar as all those events represented on and by it are equidistant from the viewer, equally near to, and of all equal availability for the viewer. Television is a bit like philosopher Leibniz's God. It chooses the best word for us. That is the one which has the most significance and relevance for us among several possible worlds. Leibniz argued that the other worlds, those that are not chosen by God, for instance, the world in which Adam does not eat the apple, were not impossible. They were logically possible. Adam, it might have so happened that Adam might not have eaten the apple. So these birds were not impossible, that they were, he used an interesting kind of concept. He said such birds were incompossible. That is not possible at the same time with the world chosen by God. Call it television. Events and objects in one world bear no relationship to those in another. They are incompossible worlds. Both worlds are possible. The world of financial markets and shopping malls, and then the world of dexterous women in a workshop in Sultanbeyli or Soweto, but not possible at the same time. The televisual then is a world by itself, a world in which the possibility of another world, that is to say difference, is denied and eliminated in a sophisticated, technologically produced visual verbal language, while it is also the possibility of a different world is also evoked, implied, and perhaps even promised all the time. The field of media and communication studies is established by the divisibility of the sign, its infinite errings and wanderings. So it's a bit like the writer Borges's garden of forking paths. How can we teach our students to read other worlds within the world of media? Other worlds within the world as always already established, presented, represented by the media. A world is always a world of signs, and therefore readable through its signs. The task of the media scholar must be to make students reader citizens of a democracy to come. I have referred about to a sign that is on the run, an inscribed trace or mark. And I asked how we interrupt its fluency, how to make it readable as a sign of another world within what we know as the world. I need to emphasize that by the reader citizen of a democracy to come, I am referring to something a little different than media literacy. Including its critical version, media literacy is limited to identifying stereotypes and bias and developing communication skills to fight them. It is surely useful work. But it also takes the risk of legitimizing such attitudes in reverse, because it does not seem to have an awareness of the abstract structures behind what it constructs as attitudinal problems that can and must be corrected. Reading these abstract structures, economic as well as unconscious codes behind contemptible racist sexist behavior is tracking the inscribed trace. It requires a different kind of competence for which the model might be literary artistic, capacity to read. And something like its working principle is nicely put in Roland Barthes' Wit. The death of the author is the birth of the reader. And here is a picture . As you see, my communication skills is close to zero. Okay, there you go. Here's a picture I found on the internet, site of BBC Turkish. Do you follow BBC Turkish? After the referendum in Turkey in 2017, a moment of political crisis. The picture is not particularly aesthetically pleasing, rather an ordinary piece of journalism. It is put on top of a news item, which offers an informed discussion of the results of referendum in interviews made by two social scientists, one of whom is my good friend Neşe Özgen. It must have news value, that is to say, it qualifies an effort of recoding value in the face of its incessant decoding by the movement of capital, such as we have seen in the financial market. There is no particular reference to the voting behavior of these female workers, though there is some reference to the working class vote in general. BBC Turkish is a site followed mostly by educated middle class Turks. Assuming we are the address here, because we are the educated middle class Turks, assuming we are the address here, what is being sent to us in this picture? And what is it that has arrived without arriving from another world in no time at the speed of thought? Perhaps it is seen by the photographer or the editor as an amusing picture, which involves two uneducated working class people and possibly Islamist because covered ladies who seem to develop some interest in possibly a political rally during the referendum days. But maybe a totally different event, who knows? All this is contextual inference because of the polysemic nature of the photographic sign, but also because reading is always an act of filling in the blanks. The sign is on the run, arriving without arriving. These two female workers, possibly clinic ladies working in a government institution or school, hence affective labor, are looking out of a window, which is covered with a flag. They must have interrupted their work to look out. One of them has just lifted the flag up, throwing a curious, smiling look, showing an interest in the scene we don't see. Another has noticed the camera that is directed at them and looks disturbed. If you're Turkish, you can almost hear her saying, "Kız çekil, çekiyorlar. Get back, girl, someone is shooting." I have just filled in another blank and have made the woman say something by drawing on my cultural experience with similar people. And here is another blank. Will the other one follow the warning? We don't know. What we see is a moment taken from a continuum. A photograph is what Freud called fetish. And Marx might have added that it is the enchanting, captivating part of this commodity or service called news. If we go on reading by putting our imagination at work, we could add that get back is an order, a command, which regulates the lives of these women. An inscription that has marked their bodies. They are told to get back, to make themselves invisible, to cover themselves. That is how their subjectivity is formed. So it is also, in some strange sense, a power they have. They have a power of hiding themselves. However, one of them has lifted the flag up. She's interested in what is going on outside. As they're also told all their lives, to stand behind the flag, what is it that motivates her now, at that moment, to lift the flag up, to appear, to uncover herself, just to look and enjoy what is going on outside? This is a blank I should prefer to leave as blank. In this ordinary act of reading, I'm actually trying to reach their world, which is incompossible with my world. Although Roland Barthes defined the press photo in terms of studium, that is to say, a general knowledge subject to easy decoding through the familiarity of common experience, such as I have done. I will betray our master by trailing an inscribed trace that arrived at me without arriving. I have found in this photo what Barth found in more artistic photography, a punctum, a puncture or wound, which is the cleaning lady's gesture of lifting the flag up. Somewhere else, Barth makes a reference to Baudelaire. He quotes him, and Baudelaire says, the emphatic truth of gesture in life's grand occasions. This was a sarcastic remark by Barth because he was talking about the sport of wrestling. Although a political referendum is certainly a grand historical event, I will betray Barth once more and rewrite him. The vanishing trace of gesture in life's small occasions. Follow the track. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lukman. Any questions? No. Thank you very much again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are taking a short break from our program. Hope to see you again in 15 minutes. Dear guests, welcome again. I would like to ask if you have any questions to Professor Mutman. Yes, please.
BBC News photographs are reflecting Orientalist.
Yes, we have already talked about it in the break. Yeah, you're right. I agree. I mean, there's as you have said in the break, there's a particular kind of focus whenever they put a picture from Turkey. There's a particular kind of focus on mosques, covered women, whatever. I mean, I would agree, but I would tend to think that that's also a certain kind of coding of value. I mean, Orientalism is not simply a bias. It's actually the language of the system, the language by which the system is working, the global system. And it might be degrading, stereotypical, etc., but it might also be, as we have just talked, it might also be very positive. I mean, there are, numberless Orientalist people, Middle East experts who love the Middle East and they love China and they think the Chinese civilization is great and Islam is blah, blah, blah, blah, whatever. I mean, this is, it doesn't make them necessarily non-Orientalists, So Orientalism is not just production of stereotypes. It's a whole language. And it's a system of evaluation, right? East, West, this binarism dichotomy is a system of evaluation. You produce value by speaking this language, either positive value or negative value that you're attributing to the East. But you are absolutely right. Yes, there is a particular kind of focus on what makes Turkey look Oriental.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to ask two questions or 2 points I want you to analyze. My name is Nadire Matar from Biyanet, journalist. The picture, BBC picture, when I look at it, first I see the flag What do you think about the flag? And this is first questions. And the other one, veiled woman. When you see veiled woman, is it a cleaner or factory worker? How about to see these two women as academicians or journalists?
Yes.
From gender perspective. Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Thank you. No, thank you. That's a very good question, actually, because you have just said, you have in a way demonstrated the point that I was trying to make, that the arrival of signs are at the same time they're non-arrival. Which sign is arriving at us? You know, who is reading what, where, when? The question is always open, even though our machines, codes, programs keep producing these signs and sending them at certain kind of addresses. Still, the text is wide open. The reason why I have thought they are cleaning ladies is they just look like cleaning ladies. I mean, they could have been factory workers. That's possible. But again, the other sign that I've seen there, the flag, I am imagining that the flag, I mean, help me out here, Turks. The flag would be put up on a school or a government office rather than a private factory. So that's what I thought, they must be cleaning ladies working in some kind of government office or some kind of, or a school or, a place like that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Their dresses are typical. It's the blue dress is the typical. Yes. Thank you, Fulya. Yeah. See, my cultural competence is actually weak. Their dress, this blue dress that they put on, that's very typical Turkish cleaning lady kind of dress. Yeah. The flag, of course, it's interesting because what I found interesting there is that she's looking out. And I thought this might, lifting it up. What's going on there? Yeah. I mean, that's I thought a very nice moment actually. That both pieces of clothes are there, the flag and the veil. So it's a good metaphor, I thought. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Dear guests, our second keynote speaker, Professor Stina Bengtsson. Professor Bengtsson works in the area of media and everyday life and has for the past 25 years been exploring how people coexist with media from phenomenological, material, spatial, and ethical perspectives. In her work, she has approached media experiences from a detailed micro perspective, aiming to understanding how the media as practices, technologies, and texts play a fundamental role in everyday life and in the construction of a good life. She is currently involved in the research project that explores the meaning of the news from the phenomenological perspective of young adults in varied cultural contexts as a collaboration with Swedish, Estonian, and Russian researchers. Another current project explores dimensions of mediatization of everyday life. Throughout her work, Bengtsson employs phenomenological approaches to media and media use, calling the embodied and sensorial dimensions of media technologies as key areas of attention in the media research. She is the author of the many articles and books, including Don Quixote of the Youth Culture, Media Use and Cultural Preferences Among Students in Estonia and Sweden, Digital Media and Dynamics of Civil Society, Retooling Citizenship in New EU Democracies, and the educational volumes, Media Landscape, Media Culture, and Theoretical Traditions in Media Research, Bankston teaches on all educational levels and is currently Vice Dean of the Faculty Board. She has been visiting research fellow on the London School of Economics and Political Science, Unity of Calgary, and Helsinki University. We are glad to have the chance to listen to her presentation titled Teaching Media and Communication in the Digital Age, Change and Continuity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our honor to call the stage. Please welcome Professor Stina Bengtsson.
Yes, thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this great colloquium. It's really an honor to be here. It's my first time in Turkey, and many people have told me that this is a great place to explore Turkey, so I'm very happy that I ended up here for the first time. Yes. I'm also very happy to be able to talk about this, the relation between research and teaching. And I see, because I think that as media researchers, we are actually one of the people that are most, that has most knowledge about what young people do and think, as we meet so many young people regularly and really get a good understanding of their worlds, their media worlds, their perspectives on not only themselves, but also the world and their, and also ours, of course, future. Young people today have to face a future that may in some respects seem quite problematic. Recently, a war broke out in Europe, something that, among many other bad things, of course, has highlighted the importance of the media for democracy and the many new ways to spread false and dubious information. Related to this is also the increasing domination of media technologies and data, where algorithms and media infrastructures in many different areas challenge human agency. And on top of this, we also have the climate changes, where media research and practice will have an important role in the profound transformation of everyday society we all urgently need. As media scholars, we need to make sure our students have the necessary perspectives and skills that is required to meet these global challenges. And what I'm going to talk about today is, on the one hand, youth culture and how it is played out in contemporary media culture, but also what this means for us who teaches varied media classes and has the opportunity to educate the people working in the future media industries. And in this presentation, I will draw on a range of existing research about youth culture and the media, but particularly so on my own comparative research project that I'm currently conducting together with colleagues in Sweden, Estonia, and Russia. And I must here just say that since I'm mentioning Russia, we have conducted field work in all these three countries, but the Russian interviews and the Russian field work were conducted before the war. So this is like a very different context, I would say, and it is actually feels extremely sad to read our Russian interviews at the moment, because they are very positive and full of hope for the future. And so keep that in mind when I speak. This project started out of a feeling of unease about contemporary discourses, in particularly news research across the world, where a common narrative, although of course not the only one, kept assuming that young people are no longer interested in news, they no longer consume news, and that this points to the even more troublesome notion that young people lack interest in the larger world beyond themselves. Another vantage point for the project was, of course, also the heavily restructured media landscape we now face, increasingly dependent on infrastructural media, self-learning algorithms, and data gathering. Young people's worlds and its future conditions is hence structured and governed very differently from how it used to be only a couple of years ago, or only a couple of decades ago, when, for example, I was young.
In everyday life today, this means we are more dependent on the media than we used to be. We use media even more profoundly than before to organize time and space, even though we, of course, have used the media to organize time and space, but we do it in different ways now. We use them to monitor and control both ourselves and others, for example, through health apps, and we track our children perhaps via their mobile phones, etc. And to organize and manage our emotions through, for example, dating apps, but also other social media platforms. Another huge transformation compared with, say, 20 years ago is that information flows today are inherently different than they used to be. Alongside the decreasing use of news journalism that we can see sort of in many countries across the world, but we also see that the number of information providers has increased tremendously. Governmental and transnational organizations today speak directly to citizens on a global as well as a local level, something that, for example, became very clear during the pandemic, where people across the globe went directly to their own national health services or to the World Health Organization to be updated about the latest COVID-19 news. And on YouTube, in social media, podcasts and blogs, many new groups speaks directly to interested audiences without editorial filters or topical restraints. So the possibility to be updated and informed today is much larger, but also more diverse than it was before. The very concept of news is also changing. On Facebook, for example, the news feed provides a mixture of information about local events, discussions in smaller groups, updates from friends, relatives, and acquaintances, ranging from what they had for breakfast, for example, to newborn babies, those who passed away, and weddings. And all of this packaged under the news feed umbrella. And in this profoundly different media landscape, me and my colleagues started to ask ourselves, what is news really? When media scholars ask young people if they are interested in news, do they really know what the answer is about? When we say that young people lack interest in news, what do we mean by that? And in my home country, Sweden, I can also tell you that we have sort of a long range of audience studies that have been going on since the 1970s. So we can actually see long lines of, for example, interest in news, use, etc. And you can see that they have been very sort of flat curves for a very long time. But now interest in news, for example, is going down, etc. And what does that mean? We started to ask ourselves. In order to answer these questions, we decided to penetrate not only the question of what the concept of news means to young people today, but also how news relates to wider media and information practices, everyday life, and a sense of meaning more generally. When young people think about news today, what do they think about? Is news, as in news journalism, at all meaningful to young people? And in that sense, how? And if not, where do they find meaning? And to try to answer these questions, we developed a theoretical framework, and I will show you that. We developed a theoretical framework building on phenomenological theory in order to perceive the meaning of news, both the concept and the phenomenon from young people's own perspectives. And I'm not going to say that much about sort of how we did and how we used phenomenology. You can either read the article or ask me more about that later or after the speech, for example. We used qualitative interviews and also before the pandemic, think aloud methods, where we asked the young interviewees to describe how they used media in a very broad sense during an ordinary day, and not least important, what it meant to them. We asked questions about what they were interested in, what was important or even necessary for them to be updated about, what they did not want to miss out on, and how and where they found that information. And in the interviews, we didn't mention news if it wasn't brought up by the respondents, until very late in the interviews, because then we started to ask, if we hadn't been talking about news at all, then we asked them about news and what it was for them, what it meant to them, etc. But not until that was quite clear anyway, from what we had discussed before. This approach provided us with broad knowledge about what young people do with the media in everyday life and in what various ways it is meaningful for them. Building on what we learned in our project, but also on research conducted by others, I will comment on and bring some new perspectives to sometimes taken for granted assumptions about youth and media, and particularly news and information. And later today, we will listen to Mark Dose, who was very early in commenting on the ubiquity of the media. In his book from 2012, Media Life, Dose argued that we no longer live with the media, but in it, and that this also affects how the media is experienced. If we live in the media, Dose argued, it will be invisible to us, just like water is to fish. And since Dose's book was published, we have seen a profound process of datafication, where more and more areas of human life are not only digitized, but datafied, an essential change in how we use and perceive the media, but also how the media use us. This development, it is often argued, means that media has been invisible. We no longer see it, but it also leads to an increased interconnectedness of spheres and a collapse between online and offline, public and private, work and leisure, etc. And this rapid and profound transformation has pointed to the role and importance of infrastructural perspectives on the media to understand how the media turns yet new aspects of media life or people's lives into data in order to sell them and make them profitable. And research today shows that people are largely unaware of the depth and breadth of datafication, and we certainly need more research in this field. And in relation to this, mine and my colleagues, but also others' research also show that digital media have become such an integrated part of everyday life that it is difficult to distinguish between when we use media and when we do not. In a project I conducted some years ago, I used to start my interviews with a very open question: tell me about how you use the media in everyday life. And quite often, particularly the young respondents, because that was not only a project related to young people, which the current one is, but particularly young respondents replied, let me instead tell you about when I do not use them. That's much easier. And images such as media-free zones in everyday life were used to explain how the media was something that was always there, except in some well-distinguished situations. So people could, for example, say, I never use it in the bathroom. I don't use it in the bedroom, not when I meet my grandmother, for example. But they basically could talk more easily about when they did not use the media than when they did. So, and this actually confirms, I would say, then Mark Dose's thesis about the media life. So how do you then study the meaning making of something that you can hardly see and that people are largely unaware of? This is, of course, a very difficult task and something that needed a new approach. In order to get a grip on when, where, and why the media was used, it was therefore necessary to break with the ubiquitous experience of living with media and to make it visible to the respondents. We used interviews as our main method, and in these interviews, we, in a very, very detailed manner, asked our respondents to tell us about an ordinary day from when they woke up and looked at their phone, which was what they often started the day with, followed by questions of exactly what they used to do, sort of why do you change between apps, which one do you start with when you have gone through all the your morning apps, because many of the young people said that they had like a morning ritual when I start with Instagram and then I go to Facebook and then perhaps a newspaper, but in fact not very often. and then perhaps they sort of laid away their phone and started to do other things. What do you do then? So we try to get very, very detailed information about that. So we asked questions followed by follow-up questions of exactly what they used to do when they choose one app, why they choose one app before the other, why they change between apps, and what meanings it brought to them. And through such an approach, we got a very nuanced and multiplex understanding of how life with digital media is played out and why, how, and for what purposes the media is used in everyday life. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our findings. As you can understand, we have a huge material. The number of interviewees all in all are around 200. Sometimes I will talk from the larger material, the 200 interviews. In some of my sort of conclusions, I will only use the Swedish data, but then I will tell you about that. Okay, what did we find? Well, from the nearly 200 interviews in the 3 countries, we found that different apps have different meanings for different people. Perhaps not very surprising, but not often said, because often people say that the media is everywhere, digital media, we have the big fives, the big platforms, for example, and we have the big fives, but they are used differently and for different purposes in different countries, in different groups, by different people, and also differently over time. Besides the obvious aspect that young people in Sweden and Russia use different social media platforms, for example, it was also very obvious that young people manage their own media worlds in distinct and quite similar ways. Some, for example, used Facebook for official information and specific tasks, such as looking for a new flat or buying secondhand clothes in the marketplace, while others mainly used Facebook as a means to communicate with their grandmother. Some only followed close friends on Instagram, while others used Snapchat for such purposes. And the young people we interviewed in Russia hardly used news journalism at all, as they did not consider it trustworthy. But in Sweden and Estonia, on the other hand, most youth turned to news journalism once in a while, but mostly when they absolutely needed information they knew they could trust. Others found it much more meaningful to go directly to NGOs, governmental authorities, particularly in Sweden. They were very keen on going to governmental authorities or associations and not having to spend time on journalism to be updated. Yet others turned to influencers they trusted to get accurate information, as they relied on them to have made a proper evaluation of what would be interesting and useful to know. And what can we conclude from this then? One conclusion is that digital media is a landscape, as a metaphor, used and managed differently by different people. We know, for example, that Facebook today in many countries is a social network for the old, and that young people mainly use it as a platform for official announcement and purposes. But it's also shows that media use is culturally situated. Media researcher Elisabeth da Costa has, in a previous study here in Turkey, shown that young media users in Turkey, for example, used Facebook in a distinctively different way compared to how it is generally discussed in media research. Because in media research in general, people often talk about this context collapse that digital media, and particularly Facebook, diffuses the boundaries between work and leisure, between private, public, etc., etc. Because what she showed that here in Turkey, and this is probably extremely obsolete, maybe young people in Turkey no longer use Facebook, I don't know, but what she showed was that it was common among Facebook users to have several different accounts in order to manage one's different social circles. One account for the family, one for one's friends, one for school, etc. And in another project conducted among young people in Argentina, Pablo Boskovsky and his colleagues has shown that young users deal with a manifold of digital platforms in distinct ways to make the most sense of different platforms in their specific cultural context. And in my project, we can see this too, with the addition that the structure of the landscape is shifting both between countries and over time. And young people often describe how they find new apps and abandon old ones to fulfill their purposes. And we could even see during the time that we conducted our interviews that, for example, the meaning of TikTok changed very quickly. So in the first interviews, people were like, yeah, I'm using TikTok, but don't tell anyone. But then everyone used TikTok sort of towards the end. And another conclusion is also that young people know well what they want to be updated about and where to find that information. They also developed different communicative practices for different spheres of everyday life and found a functioning way to navigate between the media technologies they had at hand. Although the specific platforms differed both between and within the three countries, young people in all contexts use similar strategies to distinguish between platforms for different purposes, for school, for work, for friends, for family, and also, of course, for information and news. There was a logic in relation to which they managed everyday life and the way they communicated and kept informed about the world. A logic which shows that young people today are not indifferent, disinterested, or disengaged because they dismiss news journalism. They only find new ways in a new media landscape to get what they want in terms of information and other important meanings the media can have. Yes. Another important insight that we got from our meaning-oriented perspective, and I think that this is perhaps the most important sort of finding that we did, one of them at least, but that also underlined what I just said, was also the continuity of media culture or human culture or whatever you wanted to call it. I started out by saying that the main starting point of our research project was the question, what is news? And after a couple of years of fieldwork, a plausible conclusion can in fact be the question, what is new? Because when we put together and systematized the rich and detailed data that we had gathered through our years of fieldwork, we got quite a deep understanding of the different purposes the media held in young people's everyday life. It included, of course, ritual aspects such as getting ready to meet a new day, a role previously held by radio and for many people the morning paper, but that we could see that young people use social media in an extremely similar way. But also to stay informed about things in the world that matter to them. In an attempt to particularly focus on the information repertoires of young people, we put together a map, you could call it, of the different things that young people said they wanted to stay informed about. And that included the things you can see here on the screen. On the one hand, things that happen in my local area and or affects me personally or people close to me. And this includes things such as what the weather will be like, if public transport works adequately, if my university course or office, for example, has gone online. Since most of the interviews were conducted during the pandemic, this was a question that was constantly in question for the young people. What happens to friends and acquaintances? This includes, of course, what close friends and family are up to, as a way to participate and make comments about ordinary things, but also about keeping up to date with larger events in the lives of more remote acquaintances. I want to know if my old classmate has gotten engaged, for example. Public events in my local area, if there are concerts, festivals, public lectures, etc., in the place where they live. Entertainment, TV series, new podcasts, music, films, etc. Sports, information about favorite clubs or sports celebrities, also what other people think. Others' opinions were of great interest for them. And lastly then, what happens in the world more broadly? And as you can also see in the slide, I sort of put together very quickly or a bit, I mean, this could be made, of course, much more in detail, but you can see where they mainly found this information. A lot of social media, of course, sometimes news journalism, not that much, but a lot of social media, and that could be, of course, both. I mean, social media can be influencers, and it can be groups, and it can be activists and traditional media, etc. So it was really a mixture of many different sources and many different ways to get this. But these are sort of the main areas of interest for them. When we had put together these areas of interest, they seemed very familiar. And in fact, they reminded us of what we remembered from our own childhood or from journalism research conducted long ago. So we started to look for early studies of what people read and liked in the local newspaper, for example, some 50 years ago, like in the 1970s. And look what we found. This is taken from one of the old Swedish news researchers that I talked to you about briefly before, like a reader study conducted in the late 1970s about not sort of what people actually read in the local newspaper. And just to contextualize this a little bit, at this time in Sweden in the 1970s, almost everyone subscribed to a local newspaper. So that was really the source of information for most people. And what do we see here? It's divided between female and male readers, but you can see female readers, family news, radio, TV, letters to the editor when people write letters and send them into the newspaper, home and household, and also news. Male, radio, TV, family news, entertainment, editorials, that's also the opinion piece, sport, and news. And just to also look at young readers at the same time in the 1970s. They were interested in entertainment, radio, TV, family news, sports, and also news, but not that much. So what one could actually conclude from this is that the basic interest and the things that people want to be informed about are in fact very, very similar when comparing what people were interested in 50 years ago. And that indicates that from a user perspective, things are pretty much the same, with the exception that many of these aspects you have to look for outside news journalism, as they are no longer in the paper. Local ads, for example, family ads like notifications of newborn babies and all that, sports, etc., are all more easily accessible outside of news journalism. So if you're interested in a football team, you get much, much more and better information if you go directly to the team or to someone, to an influencer who works with that team, etc. So it makes, in a way, sense that people are abandoning news journalism. And one could also actually ask the question, if it really is the people or users who abandon news journalism, or if it is news journalism that actually abandoned them because they have to go somewhere else to find the same information. So what does this mean for us then, who teaches media and communication and journalism, PR and design? How do we make the media visible and help students to see the world around them in order for them to change it? How do we reach out? How do we reach such new perspectives on the familiar, particularly when the familiar is so invisible to us? And from the background of what I just told you, I will put forward a couple of things that I hope will help to shed light on some important aspects of media education. First, that young people are quite similar. That young people are quite similar to what people used to be, and the fact that media technologies have changed profoundly during the last decades has not changed them to a very large extent. Although young people use media in a different way compared to how people used it before, they do it for the same purposes and with the same goals, and it is meaningful to them in similar ways compared with how media were meaningful in previous times. Having said this as a general conclusion, some things are of course different. The ubiquitous character of the media is of course a question. How do we make students aware of something they can hardly see? Another aspect is how quickly the contemporary media landscape is changing. New apps, TV services, podcasts emerge all the time, and it can change quickly what technologies people prefer to use. And seen from the perspective of our students' future life, it is not likely that this development will end. We will probably have this very quickly, like fluid media landscape also in the future. People who are young today will keep having to adjust to a rapidly changing media landscape where new media technologies will follow old ones for longer and shorter periods. And I would like to put forward some partly contradictory aspects of media education that I believe will be important for future media research and education. And this builds on the fact that it seems as if people are interested in the world and what happens around them in basically the same way that they used to be, but also that they are very sort of independent in where they find this information. So they want it to be meaningful for them, and if it's not meaningful for them, they will go somewhere else to find this meaning. So first, I think we should anchor the students' knowledge in their own world. Young people today are used to selecting media technologies and content that feels meaningful to them and that they like, and therefore it is important to construct our media education so that it is meaningful to our students. I think we can learn a lot from the Brazilian researcher in education, Paulo Freire, and his idea of transformative learning. And this perspective is important as it not only aims at bringing new perspectives to students, but also to make them aware of their own position in the larger world. And Freire's ideas include to take the student's own situation as vantage point for learning and to make the new knowledge meaningful in relation to their own world, but also, of course, to make that own world meaningful in relation to the larger context. If we are aware that our own mobile phone, for example, is just one link in a larger chain constructed by underpaid workers digging for minerals in African mines, worldwide transportation of materials needed in the Asian factories where our mobile phones are put together, production of software and algorithms made by people in Silicon Valley who hardly let their own children use mobile phones at all. And back to the mountains of polluted garbage where our everyday devices one day ends up. This way of taking the very familiar as vantage point for bringing in new perspectives in education is a way to provide the students with new ways of seeing. I would also like to point to the role of interpretation, because I really believe the students need proper skills in interpretation. As news journalism, and to some extent also public service broadcasting, has lost the prominent position it used to have in earlier media landscapes, and as people get information from so many different sources today, they need skills to manage that media landscape on their own, because that is basically what they do. They can't rely on journalists any longer to actually sort of curate and decide what they should meet, because they don't use the media in that way. So they need skills to manage the media landscape on their own without having to rely on the help from journalists. For this, they need their own independent, critical perspective that they can carry with them throughout their life. And I can just tell you about a study that was conducted at Uppsala University in Sweden about fake news and information skills among youth in secondary school, so 16 to 19-year-olds, a project where they compared different students or pupils from different programs, the natural science program, social science program, and the aesthetics program. And what they were looking at was, on the one hand, both if the pupils believed that they were good at detecting fake news, and on the other hand, if they actually were good at detecting fake news. So did they think they could, and could they? And what did they find from this project? Well, they made mainly two conclusions. First, that those among the pupils who believed that they had really good skills and were very good at detecting fake news and false facts in the media, which was the students at the natural science programs, were those who in fact failed the most in doing so. And secondly, that those who were hesitant about their own skills in detecting fake news, pupils at the aesthetics programs, were the best in the end of doing so. And how can we understand this? What does the aesthetics education give its pupils that the other two educations do not? Well, on the aesthetics program, the pupils were both trained in creating and producing their own content, but they also achieved traditional skills in cultural analysis, interpretation, historic analysis, etc. And they learned to always put things in new perspectives and not to be too sure about a definitive truth. This shows how important it is to always be prepared to break with the expected and to understand that what you think that you see may not always be the only thing there is. So besides teaching our students to fact check and compare sources that we often do in media literacy education, and I agree with Professor Muttman here, we also need to provide them with critical perspectives and tools for how to use them. It is also well known how we all use our own experience and previous knowledge when we try to interpret and make sense of the world, and our students are no different. In my own research, the young adults in all the 3 countries often put forward, for example, photos and videos that they came across in social media as much more trustworthy than written texts. Somewhat strange, you may think. In a picture they meant, and even more so in a video, you can actually see that something has happened, and then you know that it's true. And of course, they were all aware of how easy it is to change and manipulate photos and films, as well as they know how quickly a written text could be edited and republished. But when further asked why they found visual media more trustworthy than written text, they often referred to their own media habits. Texts are just so easy to change and just publish again, they said, but no one mixes with images. You just take a snapshot and publish it at once. This indicates that it is important that media education have students practice media production to learn to critically evaluate the practices and media text produced by others. To practice media production is an excellent way to put one's own media practices in perspective and understand that the things I do, the way I do things may not be the only one. How does, for example, journalistic practices go about? How are commercials and advertisement brought about? What are the logics behind design practices, and how is content developed, produced, and end up the way it does? To have students practice these things on their own is a way to break with their own everyday practices and habits. And what does this mean then in the end? To come to a conclusion, in the current media landscape, where students need to rely on their own skills in deciding where to look for meaningful content and how to choose between a huge amount of competing data, they more than anything else need a critical perspective on the world and tools for putting this perspective in practice. Here I would like to put forward the cultural sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's concept of an epistemological break that he developed as part of his reflexive sociology. An epistemological break is a way to release oneself from one's own preconceptions about the things we have around us in order to see them in a new light. And in phenomenological theory that I have worked a lot with, the concept of bracketing is a similar approach. This means putting the familiar in perspective in order to make it visible and seen through a new lens. Such ways of working have also been used in research to make digital infrastructures visible to people who don't see that they are there. So only by seeing or experiencing the world with new eyes, new senses, and to understand our own position in that world, can we find tools to actually change it. And for us who teaches media classes, the idea of an epistemological break makes sense also in relation to technologies, the technologies that we use for teaching. And I have lately, after the pandemic, come across several discussions about the digitization of education and the notion of bring your own device, which is often put forward as a fruitful way to make use of digital tools in new pedagogical approaches. And bring your own device means using students' existing media technologies and skills as pedagogical tools. And this is, of course, we can say also a cheap way to use digital pedagogy without having to pay for the equipment. There are also positive aspects of using students' own devices, of course, as it, for example, enhances the possibility to engage and communicate with students in and outside of the classroom, to design collaborative activities where students engage in tasks together, and to weaken the border of the classroom. But I think there is a risk that if we, who teaches media and communication, journalism, design and PR and other things, only takes our students' own media technologies and, more importantly, their own media practices as vantage point for learning, as we will not bring them the new perspectives and skills that they need to understand the world around them and also understand their own practices and their own behaviors. Instead, we need to learn how others produce media in order to understand what's going on around us. And therefore, it is important that we, besides teaching our students how to fact check and scrutinize different sources, for example, in the search for fake news, perhaps also teach them how to manipulate images, construct deep fakes, and to understand the many journalistic discussions and decisions taken before an article ends up in the newspaper. Such a technological break with students' own experiences may in fact be more efficient in order to learn how to understand and evaluate the media one meets in the world. And my conclusion then, if we can provide our students with an independent, self-reflexive, critical perspective on the world, they will carry it with them during their whole life. With such an open-minded approach in relation to theoretical perspectives as well as technological skills, our students will be ready, not only to manage their own lives, learn, make sense and communicate, we will also provide them with the appropriate skills needed to go out and change the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Benston. Any questions?
Thank you again. It was a really inspiring, speech. But I think, one thing is missing because people, especially the young people who use social media and every kind of media, don't actually choose what they, watch or what they read. The algorithm chooses for us. So it kind of, has some kind of space to do more research about it because young people don't know actually that algorithm choose their news, their content, their everything. So it feels like only the consumer is responsible, but it feels like it is not the reality. What can we do about this?
Yes, I agree, of course. I mean, yes, that's definitely true. There are algorithms sort of steering what we see in social media, etc. And I also guess that there are differences between different countries. In our interviews, people are aware of the fact that that's the case. They know it, and they sort of have experiences of what happens when I click on this, I get that, and when I do this, I sort of change my sex because I want other ads, for example. So people have these strategies to sort of adjust to that. But of course, you're right. I mean, we can't completely get rid of that fact. And I agree completely that we need really, as I started out by saying, we really need research in this area. But I don't think that we only should have research in this area, because I also think that it is important to, what I tried to show was that people are sort of aware to some extent that they are sort of governed by technology, and they try to adjust to that, but they are also very, I mean, the fact that they are very unfaithful, you would say, that they sort of change very quickly between apps and between content and sources, etc., also shows that they are not only governed by technology. So I guess there is a dialectic relationship between technology and what people do and so. But yes, I agree with you.
I'm particularly interested in the complexive aspect of the study. You mentioned at some point that there were differences in three countries. So I'm wondering what kind of people you find, and did you have a chance to determine what makes the moderating factors or
Yes. Thank you so much. That's a difficult question. I would like to start out by saying that it isn't actually a comparative project in the sense that we are not actually comparing, because it's so difficult to do that. So we rather see it as we have three different materials that we can use to look at differences, but also similarities. And in the work that we have conducted at the moment, we have actually looked more at the similarities because that's perhaps more interesting, I would say, but also that we don't really have the material that we can, as you say, talk about underlying factors, and this is what makes things in this particular way in one country, etc. But I can, of course, say something about the differences. But are you interested in differences in terms of what people use, or
maybe both persons
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And what one can say then, we have these three countries, Sweden, Estonia, and Russia, and they are, of course, very different in many ways. They have very different history also in terms of the media system and all that. But what we can see immediately is that Sweden and Estonia are very similar in so many ways. And that Russia is of course the outlier, which is different, and that in many ways, of course. I mean, on the one hand, the media landscape is very different. I mean, they have different apps, etc. But some of them are very sort of relatable. You can easily relate via contact to Facebook, for example. So there are really similarities, but some differences when it comes to sort of what kind of media that people use is that it was very obvious that the Russian, it's also the case that in the Russian material, most are university students. And in the other two materials, they are very, very sort of broad. So we can't really compare also in that sense. But for the Russian university students, most of them sort of had this idea of felt that they had been sort of enlightened by their university students, actually. So quite fantastic to read them also as a university teacher, because you see what university education can do. But so they were very sort of happy about having sort of had this new vision or new perspective on the world. What they have in Russia that we, for example, don't have in Sweden is this Telegram service, where they, for example, have anonymous news providers. So we try to discuss how do you know who to actually listen to when you don't even know who it is. It's someone hiding behind there and you don't know who it is. So that was a very big difference. Another big difference, as I also mentioned, was that many of the young Russians said that they don't use news journalism or like national media at all because they knew they couldn't trust it. And in Sweden and also Estonia, it was quite similar in terms of what they actually did, because the Swedish and Estonian young people did not use news journalism either. But they sometimes did when they, for example, said that when I know I really have to have accurate information, then I go to public service. So they really trusted it, but they didn't use it anyhow. So yeah, there are some differences. Or do you want to follow up on? No, is that okay? Yeah.
Thank you again. My question is a personal curiosity question. I was wondering whether you came across during your interviews with young people who doesn't use smartphone at all, or because I have the impression that some of the young generation is going to that direction as well. So I was just curious about it.
Yes, that's a good question. No, I don't think so. Actually, not in this project, but I have had several other projects where I have come across those people. But what many people actually say is that they don't use mobile phones, for example, for a period of time. So they take time off. But then most actually sort of jump on again, or they can take a time off from social media. Some stand outside of social media, but actually not many either. So there are those cases, but not in this particular material.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for a great presentation, of course. Loved most of it. You raised a point that you said between the 1970s and until now, the tastes of or preferences of students haven't changed. That is, the 15 to 24-year-old haven't changed very much. You said that they're primarily interested in entertainment, radio, television, family, news, sports, and then finally news. Now, does that mean, trying to understand the whole context of what you're saying, that they don't consume news at all, or they consume, well, at all, a very small percent, 9 or 10%? They don't consume news at all, or they rely on news from television channels, for example?
Yes, it's a good question. No, but first, I'm not really sure that I mean. I have to think. It was a really good question. Thank you. Maybe I have to think through this. If I said that their preferences haven't changed, because maybe their preferences have changed.
Approximately.
Yeah, but what they find sort of meaningful to be informed about hasn't changed. So that's maybe I should clarify that. Most of them, and this is also an analysis that we haven't done, but I think we actually should do that, or maybe that's the next project. What I think that we can see in our material is that media use, and this is no surprise for anyone, media use is very class-based. So there is a huge class difference in this. But if I am supposed to generalize, most of them do not use news. And we have in our project, because this is so difficult to talk about, if you want to talk about news, but not ordinary news, how do you do it? We have conceptualized this as news journalism on the one hand, which is news that comes from journalists, and news, which is everything else, because that is basically how our respondents talk about it. And many people actually don't use news journalism to a very great extent. They do sometimes when they need to, as I said, when there is something that is very important to them, or so. So they get that kind of information in other ways. Many, of course, also that subscribe to newspapers, for example, the large newspapers on Instagram, for example, and then they sort of get the headlines. They seldom click on them and sort of read the articles, but they can see sort of they get the headlines. And I don't know if that counts as consuming news journalism or not, actually.
To a point.
Yeah, to a point, yeah. But what is also, and that's why I started to talk about class, because it's also very obvious that some of our respondents that then has a certain background, they immediately in our interviews, because when we started this question, what do you do an ordinary day, or can you tell me about an ordinary day? What do you do when you wake up? They immediately start to talk about news journalism and all the New York Times and the Times and the Guardian and all these things they are keep updated about. So there are huge differences, and there are, of course, also an interest in news journalism, and also a feeling that we could also see that, because I never mentioned that, but we interviewed people between 18 and 26. And there is also an age span, I would say, that the older ones sort of turning more mature, more adult, they also talk more about sort of the social dimension of reading news. I have to I have to be updated because otherwise people will think that I'm crazy, or people who work, for example, I have to be able to talk to my workmates about, I have to know what happens in the world because otherwise. So there is also like this age dimension, which perhaps means that people will turn more into news journalism consumers when they grow older. We don't know that.
As they mature or enter the workforce.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Hi. I was wondering, well, actually, I'm thinking at the same time, but I know your research is on young people's approach to news, but what if we replaced news with the word knowledge? The reason I'm asking this is increasingly I'm feeling that what I refer as knowledge is different than what the young people, or would it be okay if I use the term Generation Z or Gen Z? Or okay,
Yeah,
let's
do that.
avoid
Go
labels. All right. So, and actually your mention of this epistemological break was really, I mean, it pushed some buttons on my mind. Now, you know, it's I'm going to reflect, I mean, think on that too. So, and I remember it was there was this statistical survey on World Economic Forum webpage. I found it, and it said this young people, this generation, only 54%. There was this survey with 6,000 people from several countries. That is, I mean, it was a big group. That's what I'm saying. This, but only 54% said that the school is going to help them to for their way to build their way in the future. So that is what I'm concerned about as also an educator. That is, I mean, I know your focus is not this, but what if instead of news, the word was knowledge? What do you, or can you, you know,
sort of what is knowledge? Is that
what this this group of people, this young people, or think about knowledge? What is their take on knowledge? Is there also a break there?
Yes, but I can say some things about that, because one thing that we also noticed in the material is that also in relation to news journalism is, and as I said, I mean, many of those who actually used news journalism got it through social media. So they had sort of the headline, daily headlines, and many of them referred to news journalism as boring, as it is only facts. That's how they talked about it. It's just, I get to know that there was an accident or a fire, or I mean, yeah, I know that 8 people died, or so many football. I mean, just facts, and that's why they were like, yeah, it's good that I get this information because it's good to know, but it's not interesting. And when I really want to know something interesting, I don't go to news journalism. So I go somewhere else. I go to discussions where people talk about this, or some expert who blah, blah, has specific knowledge, but particularly I would say perspectives. That's what they were sort of asking for. And they did not think that news journalism really provided them with perspectives, but more with facts. Maybe my interpretation, there are some things that you can say about this. On the one hand, I think that it is due to the new way of distributing news, because my impression is, at least, maybe I'm very old-fashioned, but my impression is that if they would click on the links and actually read the articles, then they include perspectives and interesting discussions, etc. But if you don't do that, you only see news as facts flashing by. So that's one conclusion. But another one is also, and that relates more to school and sort of schooling, and that is that facts in itself, or I mean, it wasn't really highly value because there are just so much, and you can't take it all. That's basically sort of their take on it. So yeah, maybe some kind of answer.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, Professor Ben.
Thank you.
Taking a short break. Hope to see you again in 15 minutes later.
Dear guests, welcome again. Our third keynote speaker, Professor Mark Dews, is joining us online. Mark Dews is a professor of media studies at the University of Amsterdam's Faculty of Humanities. From 2004 to 2013, he worked at India University's Department of Telecommunications in Bloomington, United States. Publication of his work include over 100 papers in academic journals and 11 books, including Life in Media, McQuayle's Media and Mass Communication Theory, Beyond Journalism and Making Media. Publications have been translated in Chinese, Czech, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, and Hungarian. Professor Dews holds honorary appointments at the Faculty of Journalism at Lomonosov Moscow State University, Russia, the School of Communication of the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, and the Department of Communication and Media Studies of Northumbria University, United Kingdom. His work has been supported by numerous international individual and collaborative grants and fellowships, including Marie Curie, Actions of the European Commission, Discovery Grants of the Australia Research Council, and the Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Southern California in the United States. He is also the bass player and the singer of the Second Flower. We are glad to have the chance to listen to his presentation titled Life in Media World. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our honor to listen to his presentation. It's joining us online. Please welcome Professor Mark Dews.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me and you can see my presentation. If not, somebody will, I'm sure, tell me. Of course, my sincerest apologies for not being able to join you today. I mean, I've been listening to the two previous keynotes with great interest. The reason why I'm not joining you is I'm in the northeast of England, and today, or actually Monday, but today is the deadline of a book manuscript. So I've been working day and night to finish that and have postponed travel accordingly. And I'm very sorry, of course, that I can't be there, not just to hear and see you in person, but also it's been too long since I've been to Turkey. Turkey used to be my favorite place to go. I've been there about 5 or 6 times, traveled all parts of the country, and so it's been too long. Anyways, all that aside, I would like to make my presentation build upon, follow the amazing work that Stina Bengtsson is doing, and that she just talked about in her keynote. Because how are we to make sense of the way people use, think about, give meaning to, and feel about media in an environment where we live in and not with media? And Stina was very kind to reference a book I wrote on the topic that came out in 2012. And which at the time felt like a fun academic exercise, but now has become absolute reality for almost everybody. This notion that we live in rather than with media, of course, like Stina also said, in different ways for different people in different parts of the world, coming from different backgrounds, for sure. There's no universal media experience. But however, an experience and an immersive, ubiquitous, pervasive media experience it is, and of course I wasn't the first one to notice this or to try to get a grip on this. I want to go back to, you know, cultural studies literature of the 1980s, Lawrence Grossberg, communication science people like Joe Thoreau, Stephen Chafee in the 90s and the early 2000s, all publishing in different ways Hermann Bausinger in Germany in the 1980s, João Beltrão in Brazil in the 1970s. I mean, there's been scholars all over the world throughout the last 50 years who in different ways have articulated this notion that, look, when we talk about media and communication and people's lives and the role this plays in society, we cannot assume that something like the newspaper or the radio, or in our case, the internet or something, means something in and of itself to people, right? Media are used and given meaning to in conjunction. They are, as Andreas Hepp calls it, they are a communicative figuration, right? They interact, they are an ensemble, a repertoire. I mean, there's countless concepts and words that our discipline has come up with. But the funny thing is, we still, and I think Stina also really made that point excellently, haven't really figured out what to do with that notion. Like, we still keep coming back to studying, you know, newspaper coverage, or how many hours people watch TV, or, you know, the assumed dangers of violent video games, as if that is something in and of itself. And I think if we are talking today about alternate ways of making sense of media and communication in the context of teaching and education, this should be the number one thing that we should be thinking and talking about. How to finally get away from that sort of way of thinking about media and communication as specific, as particular, as distinct, and then move towards what the latest book of Pawła Boskowski and Eugenia Mitchelstein calls the digital environment, right? The notion of media as an environment and what that means. And I would like to pitch an idea, a suggestion of how to operationalize this in my talk with you today. I'll try to be brief, although you should never trust a professor when he or she says that. Because I realized that after this, you're all making your way to the coal gas factory for lunch, and I don't want to take any minutes away from that. I have to find a way to manage my own PowerPoint, which there we go. Like Stina was mentioning in her talk, that the starting point of my approach to all of this has been this notion that media are to us like water is to fish, which was a sort of I think it's an expression that has been sometimes attributed to Marshall McLuhan, which is not really correct. It's also been attributed to Einstein, not of course in reference to media, but sort of the water to fish kind of metaphor. Maybe not that important to find out who originally said this, but the point I've always been trying to make is this notion that to tickle us, to inspire us to think of media as something that is both inevitable and invisible, right? That we generally only notice when they break down, when they're gone, when they don't do what they're supposed to do, when you're trying to finish a book on deadline and your computer freezes, or the internet connection is dead for some strange reason, or something like that. How do you check the inside of a car while driving? And that's kind of the challenge that we're facing in this context. And it is interesting that in the last 10, 15 years, the social sciences and humanities, in their various approaches to media, and specifically the role of media in everyday life and society, have made a series of so-called turns, different ones, but in a way, all of them similar in trying to get at this problem. We've had the affective turn, foregrounding the fundamental observation is that the primary way people make sense of anything, and specifically media, is through emotion, to affect an emotion. People do not think about media carefully. And in fact, they can't. right? And not just because they're normal human beings, but secondly, because media are to us like water is to fish. However, in our way of teaching and sense-making of media as scholars, we somehow keep coming back to this notion that we should be more mindful and thoughtful and deliberate and rational about media. And like, no, you can't. If you expect that from people, you're already setting them up to fail. So the effective term was a way to acknowledge that and to start from that perspective. Zizi Papakarisi's work on effective publics in the mid-1990s, I think, is a benchmark book and case for this kind of work. Simply acknowledging that the primary motivation for people to engage with media is through affect, through things that they feel deeply about. And that's why disinformation and fake news and those kind of things are so powerful, not because people believe in lies and conspiracies and they're idiots, but because people care about stuff. And if you care passionately about something, you're not very sensitive to, counter arguments. Try to tell to a friend or family member who's really in love that their partner is really not very good for them. And maybe you even have evidence. Will they listen to you? No, of course not. So that simple realization is one of the major turns in our field. The second turn has been the practice turn, right? Considering media as practice to finally solve the problem of on what level should we study media, the individual level and how the individual human being makes sense of things, or on a societal level, should we look at macro theories like individualization, mediatization, globalization, look at systems and structures, and is that what we should be doing? Well, something in the middle. Through what people do, worlds get constituted. Right, so and it's such a fundamental appreciation of what happens when you use media. In media, we create worlds, and sometimes we do that deliberately when we shoot a video and upload it to YouTube, and when we tweet about a conference that we're attending, and most of the time through also what Stina was talking about, through datafication. Right, every click we make produces information that feeds algorithms that in turn present a certain kind of world to us and to people like us. And then a third turn has been the material turn, right? Finally acknowledging that media aren't just the images in our heads, as Walter Lippmann said over 100 years ago, but more specifically, media are things, right? They're stuff. They're bits and bytes and cables and disks and pixels and bandwidths and all of that kind of servers and machines and screens and all these things matter, right? Some people go even as far to say that we need a media ontology, right? That because everything we say about media, we use media to say it with. So can we actually say anything about media that media haven't already came up with themselves? I'm reminded of an interview with the late Jean Baudrillard in a French newspaper shortly after the first Matrix movies came out. The first Matrix movie, of course, in 1999. And a couple of years later, or 2 years later, Baudrillard was interviewed about the movie because the film references his work, right? His book, Simulacra and Simulations, is shown in the opening scene. There's literal quotes from his book. You may remember Lawrence Fishburne saying, "Welcome to the desert of the real," which is a quote from Baudrillard, who himself quoted this from Jorge Luis Borges. But that's beside the point. But when they asked Baudrillard, so what do you think of the Matrix movies? He said, well, The Matrix is surely the kind of movie that The Matrix would have made about The Matrix, which is, well, first of all, typically French, I guess, to say that, but also a really good point about media ontology, right? Whatever we theorize about the media is certainly something that the media would have come up with because we've used media to do the theorizing. But to taken together, these material turns, effective turns, and practice turns offer us different handles, different approaches to get closer at solving this problem of how to make sense of the role of media in people's lives and the way society functions over time. But still, so what do we do then? What is the next step? And I think the next step for me is very much is to apply it. to a real world situation and then see in the end what kind of tactics or strategies, if you will, come out of that to get closer and what we can do with media. Because that's, I guess, my final sort of concern for the way we teach and research media is that I sometimes miss us as media students and scholars or communication students and scholars. I miss us becoming explicit about what we're hopeful for. Media studies and communication science are intrinsically hopeful disciplines, right? When we worry about data and about algorithms and automation, when we fret over violence in video games or sex on television, or the stereotypical framing of Muslims or of the Orient or the Occident, of the lack of balanced reporting about war and conflict, about the vilification of refugees in European news media, or any of that stuff. Every time we worry about these things and when we ask research questions about it, what we're actually saying is, if only media would do this, this, and this, and things would be better. In other words, we're being hopeful, but we're not making that explicit. And I think we should. I think we should always be explicit about what do we really want to happen, why that is important, and what can we do to make that happen. And that's the final point. What can we do? Right? I mean, I don't see a whole lot of instructions and tips and tricks in media scholarship helping us to do something. And isn't that the essence of what media are in people's lives? When you start using media, any kind of media, whether it's watching TV, opening an app on your phone, or doing anything, you make stuff happen. Maybe not deliberately, maybe not even voluntarily, but stuff happens, right? When you open Tinder, you might meet the love of your life. When you switch on a TV, you might learn something that you've never heard before and that you will never, ever experience in your life. Alfred Hitchcock famously said television, he loved television because he said television brings murder back in the home where it belongs, which is a very funny statement, but he makes a great point, right? Media are experience machines. They allow us to experience stuff that most of us will never, ever experience in real life, like murder. So we need to be more explicit about what we hope for and what we can do, what we can make happen in media. Take back, to quote Public Enemy, take back the power, or what Manuel Castells used to refer to as communication power, that we absolutely have in a media environment. So I will do a case study of all of this when it comes to the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, I don't have time to go into all that detail. This is, of course, a horrific and profoundly saddening situation that is happening not far from where all of us live and work. I've been collecting material about the war and the news coverage and what people are doing on TikTok and Twitch and Telegram and so on since the war broke out. I would, if anybody would like to know more about all of that work, I've recorded a presentation on this separately. It's available on my YouTube channel. It's about 2.5 hours. I don't think anybody deserves to sit through that, but if you can't help it, there it is. I will just spend about 10 minutes on that today. But before I do that, maybe one last quick review of this notion that we don't live with, but in media. I just mentioned at the start of my presentation today that I was finishing a book, and this is absolutely true. I submitted the book at 8:15 this morning to my publisher, the MIT Press, so I want to. And the book is called Life in Media. It's sort of an update of the Media Life book of 2012, with the difference that it is intended as a teaching book for media studies. How can you teach media studies when we live in media? It's a problem that Stina also signaled, that I've also been talking about until now. How can you do that? And this whole approach starts from three very simple, basic ideas, simple premises that I use in my teaching, that I start all my classes with, especially on the undergraduate level. So the first one is very simply the notion that media disappear, and that we need to become wary and mindful of how this is happening. And that we love to think that we are smart and that we can still see media and that we can understand media, but we need to adopt the notion that we cannot. And I think once you accept that, things become easier to talk about. So we have to let go of the illusion that media are something real to us. Secondly, that media are not distinct things or devices or platforms or activities or whatever. Media are everything that we do. That there is no activity in life that doesn't involve media. That doesn't mean that we don't sometimes switch media off, as one of the people who in the audience who asked the question earlier, right? And there's a very rich literature on media resistance and digital disconnection and all that kind of stuff. But the argument is that even if you switch media off, even if you don't have a smartphone, you still live in media. Not just because everybody else around you is, but also is that who you are is not necessarily who you think you are, but who you are made out to be in media. For example, through databases. If you check into a hospital, you're not yourself. You are yourself as is documented in your patient dossier, right? Which is, generally speaking, a digital database that is maintained on a server, not in your country, but in the country of whatever software company provides the IT infrastructure for your hospital, which more often than not is in the United States. So media are what we do. And finally, this is a reference to the effective turn that I talked earlier about, is that we love media. And I think it's really important for us to make love explicit. Love is not an emotion. Love is a series of emotions. And it's a series of activities, right? So love is hate and jealousy and fear and anxiety. But love is also lust and passion and desire and want and need. And those feelings are the feelings that we have when we use media. Those feelings explain how we use media and what effect, if any, media has on us. Right? Media don't explain that. The feelings for media do that. And of course, media do play a formative role in all of this. So it is those three fundamental premises that sort of shape my thinking and my teaching under the Life in Media banner. I don't have time to go over all of these examples immediately, but I hope, and I would love to do that at some other point, of course. When it comes to living in media, and like I said earlier, this was kind of or felt like a fun academic exercise when I wrote about it about 10 years ago. But in the meantime, it has become this sort of lived reality. And just to give you three very quick moments in the last 2 years alone, that I had this kind of aha moment, like, wow, we are really here. 2 years ago, of course, the World Health Organization in February 2020 announced at a press conference that COVID-19 has got the status of pandemic. At the same press conference, the WHO announced that parallel to the pandemic, there was an infodemic about the coronavirus that was, and I quote, equally fatal as the virus. And when I was listening to that, I just had this moment, profound moment, like this is where what happens in media and what happens in life have completely crossed over, right? Where a virus, as it spreads online, or information about the virus, it can be considered to be equally fatal as something that enters your body. A second moment was a year later. In 2021, Facebook renamed itself as Meta. And Mark Zuckerberg announced that the company would invest significant funding into developing something he called the metaverse, a reference to an early 1990s science fiction book, the notion that our media experience would all become seamlessly integrated, for example, through a virtual reality device. And again, the same premise was at work here, the notion that everything we do in life can become seamlessly integrated in and through media. Right, the limited definition of that is through a device, and the more expansive definition of that is the notion that everything in life can become mediated and integrated, rather than having to separately log on and off and have different devices for different things. Like you can play Call of Duty here, but not on that console. You can shop on Amazon on this device, but not on that. All of that would go away, right? That is the principal idea behind this metaverse that not just Mark Zuckerberg, but almost everybody in the tech industry is currently investing in. But also here we have this life and media completely integrated and operationalized, if you will, even if it's utopian and even if it's not very likely that this will happen anytime soon. Still, the idea has become real, if you will. And of course, at the moment we're experiencing the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine, that's been going on for about 8 years since the Russian annexation of the Crimea. And what is fascinating here is the notion of hybrid warfare that we're seeing happening over the last 10 years or so. Hybrid warfare is an older concept that is increasingly popular in military circles. And what it basically comes down to is that hybrid warfare is to wage war by not just military means, but also non-military means, which primarily means media. I mean, the three basic components of hybrid warfare is first and foremost information or propaganda, disinformation, spreading propaganda, confusing your enemy, offering countless alternate versions of the truth to make people start questioning themselves, providing alternate realities. The Putin government clearly lives in one, but people in the West do too. When we argue amongst ourselves, I mean, for the Netherlands, an important moment was the downing of the MH17 plane in Ukraine by Russians, which Russia not just denied, but provided about 25 alternate theories for. And that is very much sort of part of hybrid warfare. So information. The second part of hybrid warfare is cyber warfare. So is attacking, dismantling, disrupting another country's or an enemy's information technology infrastructure, hacking, denial of service attacks, and those kind of things. And only at the very end, and which is the most expensive part, is actual warfare with soldiers, tanks, bombs, and planes. Right, so Russia's hybrid war with Ukraine started in 2012 at the end of the Maidan revolution and has only now culminated in a full-scale invasion. And that's a good example of what hybrid warfare is. But what hybrid warfare also is a case study of life in media, right? Where you cannot reach your goals in life without securing them in media. And that is what makes this military theory so powerful as a case study for media studies in looking at how that exactly works, what the different tactics and strategies deployed are, and what is actually happening on the ground. Interestingly, this is not just me saying that Russia is engaging in hybrid warfare. Other countries and for example, the West is also engaging in hybrid warfare. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that the British and American intelligence services offer regular, in the British case, even daily updates about what their intelligence tells them about the war in Ukraine. Not only is this incredibly unusual, it also is not always true. And this is what the intelligence services say themselves, but they consider these kind of intelligence updates also ways of communicating with Russia. For example, spreading news that Russia might be deploying chemical attacks, which they consider highly unlikely, but by reporting it, their idea is to send Russia a warning, don't do it. And so this is incredibly interesting and complicated, right? All these different ways of using media and information in the context of warfare without actually sending American or British or Dutch or German troops to Ukraine. And this is my final point on this particular case. This is not just the actions of a government or a state or a security service or an army. These are actions of all of us. In my presentation, the 2.5-hour one that you can find online, if you're really bored someday afternoon, features an analysis of all the different actors involved in producing media about the war, which in turn, of course, produces different versions of that war. And we see state actors, journalists, Ukrainian journalists who've just perhaps you've seen it earlier this week, the announcement received a special Pulitzer Prize in the United States for all Ukrainian journalists. Foreign journalists, there's over 1,000 foreign journalists currently reporting in and out of the Ukraine, and journalists all over the world who from afar are reporting on the war and its consequences. All of us are reporting on the war in one way or another. Kids on TikTok, both in Russia as well as in Ukraine, producing material and going so far as that the American White House even offers press briefings specifically for TikTokers. We have information technology armies at work, both in Russia as well as in Ukraine. The Ukrainian one consisting of close to 500,000 volunteers from all over the world, doing all kinds of things. For example, one activity that they're doing is training facial recognition software to identify the faces of fallen Russian soldiers, and then informing their family members back in Russia about this, because the Russian government is not doing that. Of course, all the media industries other than journalism in Ukraine that are involved in this war, either as soldiers, like famous musicians and movie directors, or producing documentaries about the war, and so on and so forth. So there's all these different actors are involved in all kinds of different ways. I haven't even mentioned artists, graphic designers, software developers, game developers. I mean, everybody in one way or another is producing media about this war. And that makes this war such an eminent case study of life in media, beyond the fact that, of course, it's profoundly horrific. I want to conclude because I can't show. I have all this material that I'm not going to show you, and you're gonna go like, but wait a minute, I want to know. All of this, of course, is on the YouTube channel. So consider this a teaser. A teaser. I'll end my presentation with something I kind of promised in the beginning. Or I expressed the hope that we will become more explicit in what we can do with all of this. And what I've always found helpful is to identify the various ways in which people enact 3 different tactics when living in media. And the tactic of fighting the media in their environment, of surrendering to the media in their environment, or becoming media. And you see these 3 tactics at play in the current war in Ukraine. Fighting the media means committing to the idea that there's still something like an actual verifiable truth out there. To refuse to accept that everybody's creating their own reality and that in media we're all living in sort of parallel universes. It's like, no, there is something like a reality, a real factual experience Consider, for example, the countless open source intelligence operations of news media and individuals around the world, fact-checking operations like Ukraine Fact, Stop Fake, and Bellingcat, and so many more. And so one thing we can do is to commit to following these kind of services, right? And to stick with what they are reporting, because we believe in facts, or we consider facts still important. Another example of that is a statement that was released early in the war by Ukrainian journalists and news organizations and other experts from Ukraine, calling on foreign journalists reporting on the war to be careful about what they were doing and to say, don't make the same mistakes that everybody else is making when they're reporting on us. Use us as expertise. Don't refer to us as the Ukraine. Don't talk about war as conflict. And other calls on everybody to take responsibility for the truth. Secondly, we can surrender to media, which is like accepting that we swim in this ocean of media, that nobody really can figure out what is actually going on, and trying to be okay with that. And what that really means is to forgive yourself for not being able to follow everything, also to stay healthy and mindful about what you're doing, to sometimes not follow the news. What I like to think of this strategy is to think of media as you would think of food. And I know you're all thinking of food because you're having a lunch right now. But to think of media in terms of calories, right? Too much of one thing, no matter how good it is for you, isn't good for you. Have a balanced diet, not too much of anything, which includes news. And to think in those terms of media might actually, it's a way to surrender, but still take responsibility. And finally, we can become media. And that's kind of what I've tried to do with that presentation, that 2.5-hour long one on the life and media perspective on the war in Ukraine, to really do a deep dive and to collect and follow everything on Twitter, on Instagram, on Telegram, on Twitch, on VK, on Facebook, in the news media, in film, in television, and just to see how it all relates to each other and try to make a composite sketch of the mediated reality of war. Now, that is something that few people have the time or the inclination to do. I certainly wouldn't expect it of anybody, but that's also a choice that you can make and that our media technologies provide you with the tools for. But none of these strategies are mutually exclusive. I mean, none of them is better than any of the other ones. But these are very distinct tactics that you can deploy and that we can also use to help students find their way and realize that when people are called upon to engage with media in a certain way, that they follow one of these three tactics, generally speaking. And each tactic has its own consequences, has its own followings. My final point, I have two very quick points to make, and then I'll shut up. And I apologize for going on too long, and I appreciate that you're all still here. At least I think you are. I could be talking into the void, and that's fine too. The first one is a quick comment on media literacy. Becoming media literate is a sort of a panacea for all of this, right? I mean, governments, organizations around the world, UNESCO has made it one of its new pillars of policy, the notion that everybody should become media literate, and that's lovely. But I would very much call for that the notion that media literacy should involve a training in emotional literacy. Like I said, our engagement with media is primarily emotional, and most of us are not very good with our dealing with emotion. We don't know, for example, when we are or somebody in our environment is in trouble. We are not very good at offering help when somebody has emotional issues or problems. Most people with emotional or mental health issues experience stigma. It's hard to talk about. And even if you can talk about it, how good are we at offering help or finding places where you can get help other than, you know, go see a doctor or something like that? That's emotional literacy. And emotional literacy rates are dismally low in the entire world, especially among men, but generally speaking. And we need emotional literacy if we ever hope to make sense of our media. And my final comment is just a tiny little example of the role of media and life in war in Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, the Ukrainian government changed its laws and its rules about marriage licenses, allowing people to get married on Zoom. The same technology that I'm using today to speak with you. And the reason for that, of course, is tragic, right? Men stayed behind or had to stay behind to fight, whereas women and children were allowed to flee the country, resulting in a refugee crisis involving millions and millions of Ukrainians. But because, of course, love endures, the government changed its laws so that people across all this distance and under these circumstances still go to get married, which I think is a beautiful thing and a reminder that love conquers all. Thanks for your time and for listening. And again, my deepest apologies that I'm not there with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Düz. Any questions?
It was too much.
Yes, please.
Hi, Mark. Thank you
Hey,
so
Stina.
much. Hello. Really good presentation. Super, super interesting. And one could, of course, ask many questions, but I was really intrigued by the notion of emotional media literacy. I think this is a super important concept, really. But could you develop on that a bit? I mean, how should we do it? I mean, what does it include?
Thanks, Tina. Yes, so emotional literacy is a concept that was developed in the 1990s in Australia by Professor Jorn and his colleagues. And the reason why it was developed is that at the time they were doing just a general sort of survey of the Australian population, like they always do, asking about a variety of things of what people were experiencing in everyday life. And I noticed a huge uptake in people reporting mental health problems, feeling isolated, depressed, anxious, lonely, insecure, and a whole range of other issues. And they began to realize this is becoming actually a significant issue affecting the lives of countless people. Also having an economic costs with people dropping out of work and those kind of things. And that there's really no discourse for it, other than, like I said earlier, go to the doctor, whatever that is, and that means, and let alone, and there's a stigma around it, and all that kind of stuff. So they developed this notion of emotional literacy, which is now fairly advanced, and the professor who came up with it now has his own company where they offer media literacy trainings, emotional literacy training kits around the world. But at the heart of it, emotional literacy consists of a couple of things. First of all, is to become better aware at how you're doing. And whether you're doing well or not well, and how to recognize. In other words, it's basically learning to listen to your body, and which ties into the affective turn that I talked about earlier in social sciences and the humanities. And secondly, is to be able to talk about this and to recognize when people around you are not doing well. Right, it's because we love to ask each other how you're doing, and then you say fine, or in Turkish you say çok güzel, like, things is nice, things are beautiful, fine, up, and off you go. But is that really what people are feeling? A lovely trick is to ask the same question twice. Just ask twice, right? How you doing? Yeah, I'm fine. How you doing? And then you get the truth. But it's a little trick like that. It's a very important part of becoming emotionally literate. is to listen to yourself and to recognize when something is going on and to be able to do that with others and to have and then of course the third aspect of emotional literacy is knowing how and where to find support. And if there isn't, to start that conversation that there needs to be support. I mean, for example, all of us in this room, I mean, we all are students or teachers, and we work at universities. Now, we all know that the statistics show over the last 5 to 10 years that students are experiencing a mental health crisis all over the world, not just because of Corona, but well before that. There were, I mean, the percentages of students reporting being depressed, being lonely, considering suicide is through the roof. And even more so, on top of that, most of the students in media communication programs want a career in the media. Did you know that the percentage of people contemplating suicide in media careers is about 3 times higher than national averages in, for example, the UK and the Netherlands and the United States? I mean, we're training people for professions that are incredibly destructive for your mental health. And that doesn't mean they shouldn't be working in the media. It should be, we should be preparing for them for that. But we don't. None of us do. None of us do. Yes, we tell students that things will be precarious and stressful, but what the hell does that even mean, right? So it's about starting a conversation about how to recognize it in others, how to talk about it, and where to find support. And when there is no support, demanding that such support becomes available, as now is happening at universities, right? Universities are finally beginning to invest in counselors, in mentoring, in different ways of grading and supervising students, not just teaching to the test, not just giving a grade for everything, allowing students to fail. How important is that? Why can't people fail at university and still do okay? I just don't get it. Nowhere in life are things like that. Right. So and the same in media organizations. You see media companies all over the world are beginning to do things like having symposia on mental health days, giving employees free access to mental health awareness applications on their phone, like Headspace or Maven or something like that. And so that's the third element of mental health literacy, and or emotional and mental health literacy. And the point for me is that in and of itself, of course, is important, but it becomes for me so obviously important when we consider how all of us talk about media, because that's the talk of emotions and mental health. That's talk about things that give us profound joy, but also pain, that makes us deeply frustrated, but also incredibly happy. In other words, we're talking about really big emotions all the time. And how good are we at handling any of this? And if I think my assumption here is, sorry for the long answer, Stina, but my assumption here is if we become better at talking about emotions, not just the bad ones, also the good ones, also simply, being expressive about what makes us happy. Like I said in the beginning, about being explicit about our hopes and our dreams and what we would like to see happen. We can then use that to take action towards media and actually take responsibility for what we want.
Yes, thank you so much. Hello, Mark. This is Gizem here. So lovely to see you, and thanks a lot for this great presentation. It's not much of a question, but maybe a comment. It's an interesting notion you mentioned about this mental health or emotional literacy. That kind of like led me to think about, as instructors or educators, I somehow think not just students, but we have certain emotional and mental crises as well. So before we fix ourselves, I'm not sure if we can be helpful to the students. So maybe universities should firstly start with the staff instead of thinking about the students. So I don't know, just like opening up a question.
Well, this is, I mean, and now I really need to be there for lunch because it's going to be a group therapy session, right? I'm often thinking about, you know, self-help literature and therapy for people with love problems, and what are the two things that all the self-help and every single therapist that helps people with relationships and love and those kind of things, what are the two things that are always the starting point? You probably can imagine what they are. The first one is communicate. Right? That's the number one thing. Like couples that are struggling, or when you are feeling lonely, or you think you're the only one that, you know, wants this or likes this, it's like communicate more, talk more, express yourself. Like communication is always the number one advice for everything. We can argue about whether how you know, the merits of that advice, but it is interesting because that speaks directly to our work and our discipline. And the second thing, and that relates to your point, is how good are we at loving ourselves, right? If you don't love yourself, how can you even imagine building up a loving relationship with anybody else, whether that's a parent or a partner or a group of friends? Self-love, and for me, self-love is not sort of narcissism or something like that, or egocentrism. It's very much self-knowledge and taking yourself seriously, as in sort of like, if you don't feel well, then you start exploring what that means and where it comes from, and how that, and take responsibility for it. If you get angry or upset about something in the media and you want to become a media researcher to solve it and to study it, fantastic. Take that seriously. What is it? Why is that so important? I mean, all of us do this with our students. Like whenever they come up with an idea, the first question we ask is, so what? And not because we're cynical, but because we want them to take responsibility for what they're feeling about this. And if they don't feel anything, then, oh, please don't do this research, right? Because it will be awful and boring. So I think it really starts with that. And so I want to acknowledge that what you're saying is, you know, how can we take care of each other if we can't, if we're not really good at taking care of ourselves? Well, that's where it starts. It's a combination of talking openly about it and taking responsibility for it. Yeah. Great point.
Hi, we haven't met, unlike the others. I'm a visual designer, which means that I spend sort of 90% of my time sitting in a studio with our lovely students, etc. But at the risk of throwing a proverbial cat amongst the pigeons, you're sitting there, and I love cats, by the way, sorry about your dog, but the point that I'm really getting at is we're sitting here sort of listening to you preach to the converted about the importance of direct communication. The previous speakers, I don't know how much of it you saw, made much the same point, that the language of communication is critically important. So here we all are in this particular auditorium. I wanted to ask you a question that is possibly unusual. Given your experience, love the way that you sort of kind of stuck it to the Russians and their invasion of Ukraine and that sort of thing, it means that you're thinking. So here we are, all of this, we're all thinking on the same level of communication. How do we deal with engineers in the world who reject notions of communication and hang by data and numbers, using numbers as a justification for some shocking decisions made at this university and doubtlessly other universities? How do we introduce the notion of communication to, there's a lot of smiles here you can't see, but how do we introduce the notion of communication and emotion to those who refuse to acknowledge it? Do you have a quick answer to that?
Let me give, and thanks so much. And I really appreciate also your reference to the material environment, right, that we're finding ourselves in, the room that we're in, the technologies that we use and everything, and how important it is to consider that as well. Let me give a hopeful answer to that. Because there's already been some really good discussion also with Stina and you and Stina about datification and so on. it was a couple of years just before Corona. I had the chance to spend some time at Facebook headquarters in Palo Alto. And one of the many things that struck me when I was there was that when they were telling me sort of how many people they were hiring every week, which was in the hundreds and thousands a month worldwide. And of course, I was asking, what kind of people are you hiring? And they said, well, increasingly we're hiring ethnographers and anthropologists and those kind of people, political scientists and social scientists and humanities scholars and students. And it's a story I've heard from other technology companies as well, is this growing awareness that the big data rush, well, it isn't over, but there is a growing awareness that simply won't do, right? That the trusting in data leads to almost inevitably really, really bad outcomes, as you reference yourself. I mean, trusting data, big data, just means that whatever horrible things in the past were there, inequalities, oppression, and so on and so forth, are just being amplified in the new system. But now they come from data, so they must be right or true. Now, I don't think seriously there's any technology company that still thinks that way. Although there is still too much reliance and trust on AI systems that are being trained with really, really crap big data bases. So there is this growing awareness that next to big data, you need small data or thick data. Right. One concept that I write about in my new book that I finished this morning is a concept that I picked up from the technology industry, which is called data empathy. And data empathy is the notion that data is meaningless without what it means to the individuals involved in the data set, for which you need ethnography, right? And you need lived experience, and you need the kind of accounts that Stina was talking about in her presentation, the kind of comments that these kids in these 3 countries were making. That's what you really need. Otherwise, all you're left with is data that says, yeah, these kids in these countries, all of them are on social media. But social media in one country, it means something else, and in another country or between 2 people means very different things. And so I am hopeful that we're seeing an emerging field of work where, and big data isn't intrinsically evil, it's just evil if we are relying on it exclusively. And so the interaction between big data and small data, I think, is going to be a really interesting field for future exploration. And this is, of course, why almost all the major voices in our field are saying that we need integrative research, right? The mixed methods, combination of methods, qualitative, quantitative, big data, small data. Very few people are doing it because it's complicated and costly, but we do need each other. We need humanities and social sciences to come together, which is one thing I've tried to do with editing McQuail's handbook, and will be doing so for the next version much more explicitly. But so it's the beginning of a possible answer. I realize it's a hopeful answer, but and it's not short as you asked me to, and I apologize.
We're in the business of hopeful, aren't we? Thanks.
Yes, we are. Thanks. Thanks so much.
Any more questions? Okay.
Mark, I'm Sevda, representing the hosting institution dean. Thanks for your contributions and this great speech indeed. We would like to see you next time here.
Yes, me too. Thank you.
Please do.
I would love to.
And for my personal curiosity, I know that you are also in journalism studies, if I'm not mistaken. So what do you think about, for instance, peace journalism regarding what's going on right now in Ukraine, etc.? Why? Because when you were talking about empathy of emotional media literacy, kind of you are talking about others-based ethics or others-based journalism, kind of remind me, you know, kind of reflections. If you heard about peace journalism, I don't know if you are following the literature, etc. Thanks again for the contribution. It was great.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I'm just going to interpret it as an invitation, but I would love to come to Turkey and back to Izmir as soon as I can. Absolutely, and I really appreciate your question about peace journalism. 1 or 2 years ago, together with a couple of German colleagues, we wrote and published a paper on ex-journalisms. And what we were doing in that paper was, what we were noticing in journalism studies is that scholars all over the world, when they report on their research on journalism, are increasingly frustrated that when their journalism, the journalism that they found or that they focused on, cannot be adequately captured by simply referring to it as being journalism. It needs something else. So they would say automated journalism or data journalism or a constructive journalism or peace journalism or community journalism or civic journalism or public. Some of these terms are old, like civic or public journalism, and some of them are relatively new, like peace journalism. Well, peace journalism has been around for a while, but think about solidarity journalism. One of my dear friends, Professor Valérie Gagnon in the US, just had her first PhD student graduate this week on a dissertation on solidarity journalism. And so it's on the institutionalization of solutions journalism. There's a project going on at the University of Austin, University of Texas in Austin, on solidarity journalism. And what is really interesting about all of this is on the one hand that journalism in and of itself doesn't really mean much anymore, right? There's so many variations, and most of them never really feature in our teaching and curricula in journalism education, which I think is a real problem. And secondly is that for journalists themselves, especially I would say among younger journalists, they feel frustrated by the traditional values and approaches in the field. I remember studies among journalism students suggesting that the #1 reason people study journalism today is because of creativity. Right? They want to creatively express themselves, and they enter into a workforce where they generally can't do that. So they do other things. I've just completed a book with a couple of years ago published a book with my friend Tamara Witska called Beyond Journalism, featuring case studies of groups of journalists all over the world doing exactly that, right? Choosing to start their own companies and businesses because they want to tell their own kinds of stories. And what all of this has in common, I would argue, is that journalism is also in the process of reinventing itself, and some of that will, contain the same elements of journalism that we've always seen, the ones that I've also referenced in my talk, fact checking and those kind of things. But some of that also becomes very different, a different way of taking responsibility for being a journalist in the world today, because the world has changed. Why shouldn't journalism be changing too? And I totally agree with you that a really interesting way for journalism to become more relevant and to take real responsibility for its role as a participant, right? Because if you observe something, whatever you're observing changes. That's a fundamental truth from physics, right? Whatever is said by an observer, right? I mean, whatever we observe changes because we are observing it. And journalists need to take responsibility for that. And one way of doing that is to become more empathic, to work together with the communities that you cover, to focus not just on the problems, but also on their solutions, to not just focus on bad news, but also on good news. And I'm not saying that's the answer to everything, but it is a way for journalists to take responsibility. So peace journalism, solutions journalism, constructive journalism, solidarity journalism are all, for me, different examples of ways in which journalists today can take responsibility and add real relevance to the work that they're doing, and perhaps even reclaim some of the relations of trust that a lot of journalists have lost around the world with their constituencies.
Okay, that's all. Thank you very much, Professor Düz,
Thank you.
for your presentation. Dear honorable guests, dear dean, dear academics and distinguished participants, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our opening and plenary sessions of the Alternatives in Communication Theory and Education Colloquium. Many of you have traveled a long way to be here. We would like to thank you very much for your effort, attention, and participation. Now we will invite you to the lunch break. Our shuttle will leave for the historical coal gas factory at 2:30. We wish you a good time in Izmir. We hope to meet you again. Kindest regards. Thank you.